The stew was almost ready when the six-legged thing dropped out of the canopy and sat down across the fire from her like it had been invited. Myra Callahan didn't look up. She gave the pot one more stir, tapped the spoon twice on the rim the way she always did, and only then let her eyes drift across the flames to the creature settling its haunches into the leaf litter. Mottled bark-brown scales, claws retracted, a long low skull tilted just slightly to catch the smell rolling off the pot. Young, maybe 8 months old by the size of it. She'd seen it twice before, always at the tree line, always gone before she could get a good look. Rye lifted her head from her paws, considered the newcomer with the flat, unbothered patience of a dog who had already decided nothing here was worth standing up for, and put her chin back down. "You're early," Myra told the creature. 10 minutes. It didn't answer because it was an animal and animals didn't answer, but its long throat rippled once, something between a chuff and a sigh, and it lay down in the dirt the way Rye lay down, front legs crossed, and waited. That was the scene the patrol walked into 40 minutes later, and it was the scene that ended, for all practical purposes, 6 years of a very confident galactic lie. Corporal Asher Venn would spend a long time afterward trying to explain to his superiors exactly what he saw, and every version of the explanation sounded worse than the last, because the truth did not improve with retelling. He had led 4 wardens on a routine sweep of the exclusion perimeter, a boundary check, nothing more. The kind of patrol that existed so command could say the forbidden forest was being monitored, without anyone having to actually go in past the first 100 meters. 6 years posted at Bramlow Landing, and Venn had walked that boundary 100 times. He had never once seen anyone go in past the first 100 meters and come back to talk about it. He saw the smoke first. A thin gray thread rising through a gap in the canopy, too straight and too small to be a wildfire, too deliberate to be anything but a cookfire. His first thought was smugglers. His second thought, the one that made him raise a hand and signal his patrol to hold, was that smugglers did not usually announce their position with a plume you could see from 400 meters out in a place where the last confirmed human presence had ended in a debris field. He went forward alone. That was procedure, a single scout, minimum signature, before committing a squad to unknown terrain. He would later reflect that procedure had never once accounted for what he found, because whoever had written the Warden Field Manual had never imagined needing a page for it. The clearing was small, walled in on 3 sides by black-barked trees whose lower branches had been woven, not hacked, woven into a kind of loose fence. A fire pit, stone-ringed, competent. A lean-to of branches and a strip of gray tarp that Venn recognized, with a lurch, as the emergency canopy off a Halcyon model supply skiff. The kind that had gone down at the forest's edge 6 weeks ago, all crew presumed lost. The wreck itself never recovered because nobody had been fool enough to walk in after it. And in the middle of all of it, a human woman crouched over a cookpot, one hand steadying a lid, entirely unconcerned that 11 meters from her own shoulder a canopy stalker, a juvenile, but still easily the length of a grown man, still built entirely out of claws and appetite, lay in the dirt like a hound waiting for scraps. There was a dog beside her, an ordinary dog, brindle and gray-muzzled at the chin, lying with its head on its paws, watching Venn with mild, unhurried interest, the way it might have watched a delivery drone come up the drive. Venn did not remember raising his weapon. He remembered with total clarity that his hands were shaking and the weapon was not. "Don't," the woman said. She hadn't turned around. "You'll spook him and then I'll have wasted a good rabbit." "There is a—" Venn's voice did something undignified. He started again. "There is a Class 9 apex organism 11 meters from your position. He's 8 months old and he hasn't figured out how to hunt anything bigger than a burrow rat yet," she said. "He's not a class anything. He's a kid who likes the smell of onions." She finally looked up, and Venn registered distantly that her face was thin in the particular way of someone who had been rationing for weeks, and that her eyes were entirely calm, and that the calm was somehow worse than fear would have been. "You're the first person I've seen in 41 days. Are you going to shoot my dinner guest, or are you going to tell me what's happened to the relay tower? Because I've been dead as far as Bramlow Landing knows, and I'd like that corrected before winter." Ven did not lower his weapon. He also did not fire it. Later he would understand that this single frozen half-minute, predator docile, dog unbothered, woman irritated more than afraid, was the moment the exclusion zone's entire 6-year mythology developed its first crack, and that he had been standing in the crack when it happened. The stalker's ear flaps. Ven had never been close enough to a live one to know they had ear flaps, swiveled toward him, then toward the woman, then settled. It made a low sound, almost a whine, and put its head down on its own forelegs. "See," the woman said. "Manners, more than I can say for you," pointing a rifle at a starving teenager over stew. Ven's second-in-command, a broad-shouldered warden named Hauk, arrived at his shoulder a moment later, took in the scene, and made a sound Ven had never heard a warden make in 6 years of service. It was not a word. It did not need to be. "Corporal," Hauk said very quietly, "what is happening?" "I don't know," Ven admitted, which was the last entirely honest thing he would say for several days, because everything after that had to be filtered through what command was willing to believe. Her name, she told them flatly, between stirring the pot and telling the stalker to move its tail out of the fire's heat shadow before it singed, was Myra Callahan, courier cook rated for the Bramlow supply circuit, 41 days missing after the skiff Wintering Hare took raider fire 8 kilometers short of the landing pad and went down along the forest's northern edge. She had a dog. The dog's name was Rye. She had, at present count, 1 working knife, a working fire starter, a case of ration bars she'd stretched into something closer to seasoning than food, and whatever the forest gave up to a person who didn't take more than she needed. She did not, at any point in that first conversation, explain the stalker. She didn't explain the 2 smaller shapes Ven's patrol glimpsed at the tree line an hour later, low and quick and gone before a weapon could track them. She didn't explain why, when Hauk moved too fast reaching for a comm unit, the juvenile stalker's head came up off its paws in one smooth motion, and every line of its body went taut in a way that made all 4 wardens step back at once, and why it settled again, boneless, the instant Myra said, without looking, "Easy. He's slow, not stupid," in a voice with no more heat in it than she'd used to complain about the relay tower. She explained the dog even less. Rye simply existed at the edge of every scene, unbothered, present, occasionally lifting her head to track a warden's movement with the flat attentiveness of something keeping score. Ven filed the report that night from the perimeter station, because none of his patrol had wanted to be the one to walk back into the tree line and confirm they hadn't imagined it. He wrote it 3 times. Each draft sounded more insane than the last, so on the 4th try he stopped trying to make it sound reasonable and simply wrote what he had seen, in order, without commentary, and sent it up the chain with a note that said, "Recommend follow-up with full escort and command presence, because I do not believe a corporal's word is going to be sufficient, and I am not sure mine would be sufficient to me either if I had not been standing there." The reply came back within the hour, terse and unsurprised in a way that told Ven someone at Bramlow Landing had already decided what had happened before reading past the first line. Warden Marshal Koraz Bethren's response was 4 words: "Corporal Ven is relieved." He was not, in the end, relieved of duty. That took 2 more days of argument that Ven was not privy to, but he understood the message underneath the message clearly enough. Nobody at Bramlow Landing wanted to believe that the Forbidden Forest, 6 years and 11 confirmed deaths deep into its reputation, as the one place on Corville where the local fauna simply could not be reasoned with, contained a starving human woman feeding stew to an apex predator like it was a farmyard dog begging at the table. It was easier to believe Ven was lying or hallucinating or the theory that eventually won out in the warden marshal's office, whispered first and then said aloud, that the woman had some kind of device, a pheromone emitter, a neural dampener smuggled in on the wreck. Something mechanical and confiscatable and safely, blessedly not what it looked like, because what it looked like broke 6 years of very convenient certainty about what the forest was, and why no one but poachers and the desperate ever went into it, and why it was easier, so much easier, to keep calling it forbidden than to ask why. Myra did not know any of this yet. She only knew that the patrol had left in a hurry, that the young stalker had stayed until the fire burned low, and that for the first time in 41 days, she went to sleep with the reasonable expectation that someone, tomorrow or the day after, was going to come back and ask her real questions. She was almost right about the timeline. She was catastrophically wrong about the questions. They came back on the 3rd day, and they came back wrong. Myra heard them before she saw them, a heavier tread than Ven's patrol, metal on stone, voices pitched to carry rather than to scout. She banked the fire, checked that rye was settled where she could see the tree line, and went on quartering the tuber she dug that morning, because standing up to greet an approaching column never once in her life had made the column arrive faster or friendlier. Warden Marshal Coraz Bethrin came through the woven branch fence first, which told Myra most of what she needed to know about him before he said a word. A senior officer who let himself be first through an unsecured perimeter into a zone his own command had spent 6 years calling lethal wasn't being brave. He was making a point. He didn't believe the danger was real, and he wanted his escort of 9 wardens and 1 nervous-looking requisitions officer to see him prove it. He was tall even for a Vantic iron-gray crest flattened back in the field style, and he looked at Myra's camp, the woven fence, the stone-ringed fire, the neat stack of firewood, the drying rack of strips that had been, until recently, most of a burrow rat, with the expression of a man cataloging evidence for a court-martial. He'd already decided the verdict of. Miss Callahan, he didn't offer a hand. Warden Marshal Bethrin, Bramlow Landing Garrison Command. I'll need you to surrender any transmitting or emissive devices in your possession, effective immediately. I don't have any. Myra set the tuber knife down, slow, both hands visible, because she'd spent 6 weeks learning that slow and visible was a language every species on this planet seemed to understand. I have a fire starter, a knife, and a dog. You're welcome to search the lean-to. We will. Bethrin's gaze moved past her to Rye, who had risen to sitting without being asked, ears up, weight settled back on her haunches in the particular loose-limbed readiness of a dog who had clocked exactly how many strangers had just entered her space and was doing the math on all of them. That is the animal. That's my dog. Corporal Ven's report described an apex predator. He was talking about Sable. Myra nodded toward the tree line, where the young stalker she'd started calling him Sable, for the color of his flank markings, because 41 days alone made a person want to name things, had gone still in the brush at the sound of new voices, not fled, just still, watching. He's not here right now. He gets shy around crowds. Bethrin's crest lifted a fraction, the Vantic equivalent. Myra had learned in 6 weeks of studying the only company she had, of a raised eyebrow. You will forgive me, he said, if I find it difficult to believe that a Class 9 canopy predator has developed a personality trait resembling social anxiety. I don't need you to believe it, Myra said. I need you to not point a rifle at him when he comes back for dinner because he startles, and I would genuinely rather not clean up whatever happens after that. It was the wrong thing to say, in the sense that it was true, and Bethrin heard it as a threat instead. Myra watched him decide that, watched the decision move through his escort like current through a wire, hands drifting closer to weapons, the requisitions officer taking a half-step backward, and understood with the tired clarity of someone too hungry to bother softening things anymore, that she had just been recast from survivor to suspect. "Search the shelter," Bethrin said to Hauk, who had come up on Myra's third day of solitude as part of Ven's original patrol and had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable about it now. "Full inventory, and get that animal secured before it does anything unfortunate." "She's not going to let you tie her up," Myra said, mild, still not moving. "And I wouldn't try." Two of Bethrin's wardens went for Rye anyway, because orders were orders and because Myra understood this too. Watching it happen, a dog was a dog, 4 legs and fur and a wagging tail half the time, and it was very hard for people who had never owned one to understand that calm was not the same thing as harmless. One of them, a younger warden with a coil of restraint cable already in hand, crouched and reached. Rye didn't growl. She didn't bare a tooth. She simply stood, unhurried, put herself between the reaching hand and Myra's leg, and looked at the warden with an expression that had ended more arguments in Myra's life than any words she owned. The warden's hand stopped 6 inches short of the dog's collar and did not go any farther, because there was something in that flat brown gaze that every mammal on every world apparently recognized on some floor below language. This is a decision you do not want to finish making. "She won't bite," Myra said into the silence. "She's 12. Her hips ache in the cold and she's slower than she used to be, and if you actually laid a hand on her right now she still wouldn't bite you, because that's not who she is. But she will plant herself exactly where she's standing until you go around her, and I've watched grown men try to go around her and give up. So, your call on how much time you want to spend on it." The warden looked at his coil of cable, looked at the dog, looked briefly, involuntarily, toward the tree line where something with claws had recently been lying peacefully in the dirt, and stood up without the restraint cable having touched anything at all. Bethrin watched this with his crest very still, and Myra had the distinct sense of a man recalculating. "You will understand," he said, "that a forest which has killed 11 confirmed people in 6 years, and which you are now telling me is populated by animals with the temperament of farm dogs, presents this command with a credibility problem. Either the danger was never real, which makes 6 years of exclusion policy an embarrassment, or the danger is real and you have found some way to suppress it that this command needs to understand and control. There is no version of events in which I simply take your word that the truth is a third, more comfortable option." It was, Myra had to admit, watching him say it, the first genuinely intelligent thing anyone from Bramlow Landing had said to her since the crash. It was also, she suspected, going to be a much bigger problem than a search of her lean-to. "There's a 4th option," she said. "I'm listening." The forest was never trying to kill people who didn't give it a reason to. She said it plainly, the way she'd say the water was cold or the fire needed more wood, because 6 weeks of watching Sable choose curiosity over violence every single time he'd had the option had worn all the drama out of the sentence for her. "I've been here 41 days. I haven't been attacked once, not because I have a device. Because I stopped, I made a fire, I fed the ones who came close instead of running, and I never once gave any animal here a reason to think I was worth killing instead of ignoring. I don't know what the 11 people who died did differently, but I'd bet good money it wasn't nothing." Bethrin's silence went on long enough that the requisitions officer shifted his weight twice. When the warden marshal finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register Myra hadn't heard from him yet, quieter, and for the first time, not entirely certain. "You're suggesting the exclusion designation is wrong." "I'm suggesting it's incomplete," Myra said. "There's a difference, and I think somebody back at Bramlow Landing might have reasons for preferring incomplete if we're being honest about it." It was a guess. She would not learn for another week and a half how good a guess it had been. But she watched something shudder behind Bethrin's eyes at the word reasons, fast, gone almost before she registered it, and filed it away the same careful way. She'd filed the location of every root vegetable and every game trail in 6 weeks of learning a forest that everyone back home had assured her wanted her dead. "Search the camp," Bethrin said again to Halk, and this time there was less conviction in it. "Full inventory," and Corporal this to Ven, who had come in with the second patrol and stood now near the fence line, saying nothing, watching Myra with the careful blankness of a man trying not to be noticed, agreeing with her. "You'll escort Miss Callahan back to Bramlow Landing personally once the search concludes. Under guard." "Under guard for what?" Myra said. "I haven't broken a law standing here. I got shot down. I survived it. That's the whole of my crime." "You are the sole witness to an intelligence failure that has cost this garrison 11 lives and 6 years of policy," Bethrin said. And for just a moment the mask of procedure slipped, and Myra saw something underneath it that looked almost like fear. "You will forgive me if I would rather have you where I can see you than out here, feeding my command's biggest mistake its dinner." Halk's search of the Linta turned up exactly what Myra had said it would: a knife, a fire starter, a case of ration wrappers, a tarp, a bedroll, and a dog-eared logbook where Myra had been recording, in a cook's plain economical hand, every animal she'd seen and every behavior she'd noted, because 41 days alone with nothing to do after dark had turned her into an accidental field naturalist. Halk paged through it with visibly growing unease, and near the end, stopped on an entry from 11 days back and read it twice. "What's this?" she said, and turned the logbook so Myra could see the page. "Sable brought a rat thing to the fire tonight. Didn't eat it. Left it by my boot and backed off 6 feet and waited. Took me a minute to understand he wasn't asking for food. He was giving it. Gave him half the stew in return. He slept 11 meters out from the fire instead of 30. Rye didn't react at all, like this was the most normal thing in the world, which for her it probably is." "That's a stalker learning to share," Myra said. "It's not complicated. Dogs have been doing it with my species for about as long as either species has kept records. He watched Rye get fed for doing nothing but existing near me, and he decided he wanted in on that arrangement. It's not magic and it's not a device. It's just what happens when something smart enough to notice a good deal gets offered one." Halk closed the logbook slowly and did not immediately hand it back. "I'd like to keep this," she said, "for the record." "Keep it," Myra said. "Just bring it back. I've got 40 more days of notes in my head that haven't made it to paper yet, and I intend to finish the job." Bethrin, listening to this exchange with his jaw set, said nothing at all, which, Myra was coming to understand, was somehow the loudest thing he'd done since walking into the clearing. They walked her out at dusk, which Myra suspected was deliberate. Easier to manage a column through the dark with a compliant subject than to give the daylight a chance to show anyone back at Bramlow Landing exactly how calm the walk actually was. Ven took point. Halk brought up the rear with the logbook tucked inside her jacket like something she didn't entirely trust the rest of the patrol to see. Rye walked at Myra's knee, unleashed, because nobody had actually tried to leash her after the first attempt, and Bethrin rode near the middle of the column with the stiff posture of a man who had won an argument and didn't feel like it. Sable followed them for the first kilometer, keeping to the tree line, never closer than 30 meters, until Myra turned once and said, "Go on. Go home," and he stopped like he'd hit a wall and didn't come any farther. 2 of Bethrin's wardens turned full around to watch him not follow them, weapons half raised, and lowered them slowly when he simply sat down in the middle of the game trail and put his head on his paws to watch them go. The exact posture Rye used at the cabin door back at the wreck site when Myra went to check snares alone. "He does that every night I go out of sight," Myra said, to no one in particular. "Sits until I'm out of view, then goes hunting. He'll be fine." Nobody answered her. She hadn't expected them to. Bramlow Landing, when they reached it 2 hours after full dark, was smaller than Myra remembered from before the crash. A scatter of prefab domes and a landing apron ringed by perimeter lighting. maybe 600 permanent residents between the human contract crews and the Vantic garrison, and the handful of Osec trade agents who ran the exchange post at the settlement's north edge. It had felt, 42 days ago, like the edge of nowhere. Walking back into it now, freshly scrubbed and lit and full of people who stopped what they were doing to stare at the woman coming out of the tree line under armed escort, it felt like a different kind of edge entirely. The edge of a story nobody wanted corrected. They put her in a debrief room in the garrison's administrative dome, gray-walled, 1 table, 3 chairs, and told her to wait. Rye was allowed to stay, on the condition, unspoken but obvious from the 2 wardens posted just outside the door, that the dog's presence was being tolerated rather than permitted. Myra sat. Rye lay down under the table with a long-suffering sigh that suggested she, at least, had opinions about the furniture, and Myra waited long enough that she'd nearly fallen asleep, sitting upright by the time the door opened again. It wasn't Bethrin. It was an old man, human, which surprised her enough to sit up fully, gray-bearded, weathered past the point where sun damage and years stopped being distinguishable from each other, wearing a canvas coat that had been patched at both elbows by someone who cared more about function than appearance. He set 2 mugs of something hot on the table without being asked, took the 3rd chair, and looked at Rye with the particular soft focus of a man greeting an old friend. "Desmond Yarrow," he said. "I run trapline maintenance for the landing when they let me, which is less and less these days. You're the courier girl." Myra Callahan. She wrapped both hands around the mug more for the warmth than the drink. "I don't recall trapline maintenance rating a personal debrief." "It doesn't." Yarrow's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "I asked. 22 years on this rock, and in 11 of them I was the last man to walk that tree line and come back with both legs before they closed it. I heard what Ven's patrol found, and I told the marshal I wanted 5 minutes before his interrogators got their teeth into it, because I had a suspicion, and it turns out I was right, and I'd rather hear it from you plain than watch them squeeze it out of you sideways." "What suspicion?" "That the forest never killed anybody who wasn't hunting something in it." Yarrow said it evenly, watching her face for the reaction. When she didn't flinch, he nodded slowly, like a man confirming a measurement he'd already trusted. "I lost a partner in there 14 years ago. Official record says predator strike, exclusion zone tragedy, don't go past the marked line. I know for a fact because I was there, and because I helped carry what was left of him out, that he wasn't setting trail cams. He had a rifle he had no business carrying and a buyer's manifest for stalker pelts in his pack, and the animal that killed him did it in about 4 seconds after he put a round through its mate's shoulder from 20 meters. I never told the marshal's office the manifest part. I was scared, and I was grieving, and by the time I stopped being either, it was easier to let the record stand than to explain why I'd sat on it for a decade." Myra set the mug down. "There's a poaching operation." "There's been a poaching operation running out of the exclusion zone for going on 15 years, Yarrow said. "Quiet, small enough nobody official has ever wanted to look too hard, because the exclusion designation does the poachers' security work for them. Nobody patrols past the perimeter. Nobody investigates a death out there past, predator strike, tragic, don't go in. The pelts move through the Osec exchange post under manifest tags for legal game from 3 systems over, and I would bet you my whole pension that at least one person wearing a warden uniform in this garrison has been paid over the years to keep that story simple." "Bethrin." "I don't know that for a fact," Yarrow said carefully. "I know he's held this post 9 years, and I know the poachings run at least that long, and I know he did not want to hear one word of what you told him out there, and men who are honestly ignorant of a problem don't usually look that relieved when someone else's testimony gives them an excuse to lock the witness up instead of asking her more questions." Under the table, Rye shifted, resettled her chin on Myra's boot, and let out a slow breath through her nose. the exact sound she made at the wreck site whenever a night noise turned out to be nothing, a small private punctuation to a conversation she had no part of and every stake in. "Why are you telling me this?" Myra said. "You just met me." "Because I've had 14 years to regret staying quiet, and I'm too old to spend a 15th one doing it again." Yarrow nodded down at Rye. "And because that dog trusts you enough to sleep on your boot in a room full of armed strangers, and in my experience animals that calm and that smart don't waste that kind of trust. I've trapped this planet's fauna for 2 decades. I know what fear looks like on 4 legs, and I know what trust looks like. And what your dog is doing right now isn't fear." "She's just tired," Myra said, but she said it gently, because she understood what he meant, and because some part of her, worn thin by 41 days of talking to nobody, but an animal who couldn't answer, was grateful past words to be sitting across from a person who believed her without needing to be convinced first. "Sable found me the 3rd week," she said after a moment. "Not the 3rd day, the 3rd week. It took that long for him to decide I wasn't a threat worth avoiding and wasn't prey worth the risk. Everything after that was just feeding him when he came close, not chasing him off, not reaching for him first. The same thing I did with Rye when I got her as a stray pup 12 years ago, if you want the honest comparison. She didn't come to me because I was strong. She came to me because I was safe and I kept feeding her, and I never once made her regret getting close. Sable's the same animal, wearing a different shape. So's the little pair that started showing up week 5. So probably is whatever's actually running that forest at the top of the food chain, if it ever decides I'm worth the walk to my fire." Yarrow's eyebrows went up. "You've seen sign of the matriarch." "The what?" "There's a story," Yarrow said, "old as the exclusion order itself, that something lives at the forest's dead center that makes everything else in there look like a stray cat. Nobody's confirmed it. Nobody's gone deep enough and come back to confirm it. But every trapper who's worked that boundary for more than a few years has heard something big move through the deep brush at night and decided very quickly they didn't need to know more about it than that." "I've heard something," Myra admitted. "Twice. Big, slow, not hunting. I know what hunting sounds like now. God help me, I've learned that the hard way. This was more like patrolling, checking. It never came within 200 meters of the fire either time." "If that's real," Yarrow said, quiet now, "and if what you're telling me about the smaller ones is real, that they're choosing you, not being controlled by you, then Bethrin has a much bigger problem than a courier who survived a crash. He has an apex predator loose in a forest full of illegal hunting activity that might, for reasons none of us understand yet, have decided it likes humans who cook." The door opened before Myra could answer, and Bethrin stood in it with 2 wardens behind him, and an expression that told her the debrief, whatever shape it had been meant to take, was about to become something else entirely. "Yarrow," Bethrin said flat, "you were told 5 minutes." "I've had 6, Yarrow said, unbothered, and stood, gathering both empty mugs with the unhurried economy of a man who had spent 30 years not being rushed by other men's urgency. "She's telling the truth, Marshal. I'd stake what's left of my pension on it. I'd also ask you, gently, as a man who's known you 9 years and respected most of them, to think hard about why that's such an inconvenient thing for you to hear." He left without waiting for an answer, and Bethrin watched him go with an expression Myra couldn't read, and then turned it, cooled and reset, back onto her. "You'll be held here," he said, "pending a full inquiry board. Standard procedure for any incident involving loss of company assets and extended exclusion zone contact." "I lost a supply skiff to raider fire," Myra said. "That's the incident. Everything since then has been survival, and you know it, and I think Desmond Yarrow just told you something you didn't want an audience for." Bethrin's jaw tightened, fractionally, and for the first time since the clearing Myra watched him choose his next words with real care. The inquiry board convenes in 3 days, he said. Until then, you and your animal will remain in the garrison's guest quarters, under guard, for your own protection. Protection from what? From a great many things you don't yet understand, Bethrin said, and left before she could ask him to name a single one. The guest quarters turned out to be a single prefab room with a cot, a washstand, a slit window too narrow for anything larger than Rye to fit through, and a guard rotation outside the door that changed every 6 hours with the punctuality of people who had been given very specific instructions and were nervous about being blamed if they didn't follow them exactly. Myra slept better there than she had in 6 weeks, a roof, a mattress, no watch to keep against the dark, and woke on the second morning to Rye standing rigid at the door, hackles up along her spine in a way Myra had seen exactly twice before in 12 years, both times immediately preceding something she'd rather not have walked into unarmed. She was on her feet before she'd finished waking up, hand already reaching for a knife she no longer had, because 6 weeks of sleeping in a forest that wanted to kill her carelessly had rewired something in her that a soft bed and a locked door hadn't undone yet. Rye, quiet. Not a command to stop. Rye wasn't making noise, but the specific low tone that meant listen with me instead of at me. The dog's ears swiveled toward the door, held, and Myra heard it too, underneath the ordinary shuffle of a guard changing post. A second set of footsteps, unscheduled, moving with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had a reason to be exactly where they were and no intention of explaining it if asked. The door didn't open. Whoever it was passed by paused long enough that Myra counted 4 full breaths and moved on. Rye held her stance another 10 seconds after the sound faded entirely, then sat, then, finally, exhaled and looked up at Myra with an expression that was almost, in a dog's limited vocabulary of expressions, apologetic. Yeah, Myra said, quietly, crouching to put a hand flat on the dog's ribs and feel the tension still living there. I heard it too, good girl. She didn't sleep again that night. She spent it instead doing the thing Yarrow's visit had given her the permission to do, thinking, methodically, about who exactly benefited from a courier, who'd survived the exclusion zone being kept quiet, isolated, and pending an inquiry board that could take as long as somebody wanted it to take. The answer arrived, uninvited, the next afternoon in the shape of a man who introduced himself at the door, past the guard, who let him through with a deference that told Myra plenty on its own, as Rook Talvin, Independent Concerns Liaison, OSEC Trade Compact. He was human, which surprised her less than it should have. Every frontier had its opportunists, and every one of them learned the local language of authority fast enough to borrow it. Mid-50s, sun-leathered, dressed in field khaki too clean for actual field work, with the particular affable warmth of a man whose entire professional skill set was making other people comfortable right up until it stopped being useful to him. Miss Callahan. He didn't sit, though he gestured at the room's single chair as though it were his to offer. I hear you've had quite an adventure. I hear you're a trade liaison, Myra said. I don't know what business the exchange post has with a stranded courier. Call it professional curiosity. Talvin's smile didn't move past the lower half of his face. I move a great deal of legitimate cargo out of that exclusion zone's border trade routes. Pelts mostly, properly manifested game from the outer systems, nothing your warden friends would blink at. It concerns me professionally when I hear rumors of a witness telling stories that could get that whole route reclassified. Reclassification means inspections. Inspections mean delays. Delays cost me money, and men who lose me money tend to find their supply contracts complicated. Rye had risen at the second sentence, not aggressive, simply present, planting herself between Talvin and the cot with the loose-limbed stillness Myra had come to recognize as her particular grammar of I am not doing anything yet. You're the manifest tags, Myra said. It wasn't a question, and she watched it land, Watched Talvin's affability cost him a fraction of a degree of temperature before he recovered it. "I'm a businessman with an interest in stability," he said. "I'd hate for an inquiry board to hear testimony that makes them start counting pelts against permit records. It would be a shame for that testimony to get complicated by, say, questions about the witness's own judgment. 41 days alone in a lethal exclusion zone does strange things to a person's account of events. Predators that share meals. A dog with better manners than a warden escort." It's the kind of story a tired, traumatized survivor tells herself to make sense of surviving something that shouldn't have let her. "You're suggesting I'm lying." "I'm suggesting," Talvin said gently, "that the truth is often more comfortable when it's simple, and that simple stories tend to go better for the people telling them. Predators strike. Tragic. Don't go past the marked line. Nobody has to reclassify anything. Nobody has to look too hard at 15 years of manifest tags. And a courier who's been through a genuine ordeal gets to go home with her dog and her back pay, instead of getting dragged through an inquiry that could take months and end with her word against a warden marshal's career. And if I don't tell the simple version." Talvin's smile finally reached his eyes, and it was worse there than it had been anywhere else on his face. "Then we'll all find out together how thorough an inquiry board can be about a witness's competency, won't we? I do hope that won't be necessary. I like you, Miss Callahan. I'd rather this stayed friendly." He reached, as he said it, to pat Rye's head on his way past her toward the door, the casual, unthinking gesture of a man used to animals existing as furniture, an afterthought gesture that cost him nothing to make and meant nothing by it. Rye didn't growl. She didn't move at all, in fact, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had simply held, dead still, and looked up at his descending hand with an expression that stopped it 4 inches short of her skull, the same way it had stopped a warden's restraint cable 6 inches short of her collar in the clearing 3 days before. Talvin's hand hung there a moment. Something passed over his face, not fear exactly, Myra thought, but the first genuine flicker of a man recalculating a variable he'd assumed was decorative. He lowered the hand slowly and stepped past the dog instead of over her, and did not try again. "Think about the simple version, Miss Callahan," he said from the doorway, voice smooth again. "For everyone's sake." He left. Rye watched the door for a long 30 seconds after it closed, then turned and pressed her head, hard and deliberate, against Myra's knee. Not a demand for comfort. Myra had learned to read the difference over 12 years, but something closer to a report filed. Noted. Handled. For now. "Yeah," Myra said, and sat down on the cot's edge, and for the first time in 6 weeks let her hands shake, just for a moment, now that there was no one left to perform steadiness for. "I know, girl, I know." She found Corporal Venn an hour later. Or rather, he found her, appearing at the door on what he claimed was a routine check, and staying considerably longer than routine required, standing with his back half turned to the hallway in the particular posture of a man who wanted to be overheard doing his job, and not overheard doing anything else. "Talvin came to see you," he said, not a question. "You knew he would." "I suspected." Venn's crest was flattened low, a posture Myra had learned by now read as something between shame and resolve. "I've served under Warden Marshal Bethrin for 4 years. I have filed 3 separate incident reports in that time regarding pelt shipments out of the exclusion boundary that didn't match any legal hunt manifest I could find on record. All 3 were closed as administrative errors within a week, faster than any genuine administrative review has ever moved in my experience. I did not have proof of anything beyond a pattern. I told myself a pattern wasn't evidence, and I let it be someone else's problem, because I am, as it turns out, exactly as capable of choosing comfortable ignorance as anyone else in this garrison. So why tell me now? Because your dog just stopped a man's hand from touching her without making a sound, and it was the single most honest piece of evidence I have seen in 4 years of filing reports that went nowhere. Ven's voice dropped further. Halk has your logbook. She's been cross-referencing your sighting dates against the OSEC Exchange Post's manifest log dates, not names, nothing that would draw attention yet. Every death this exclusion zone has on record lines up, within a day or two, with a manifest entry for pelts of a matching species. 11 deaths, 11 manifests. It is not a coincidence, Miss Callahan, and I do not believe Warden Marshal Bethrin is unaware of that fact, even if I cannot yet prove he's taking money for staying unaware of it on purpose. Then get me in front of the inquiry board, and let me say what I know. The inquiry board doesn't convene for 2 more days, Ven said, and Talvin just told you, in this room, in front of a dog with a memory for faces, that he'd rather you didn't survive to say anything complicated. I don't think that was a metaphor, Miss Callahan. I think you should assume he meant it, and I think you should not eat or drink anything in this garrison that I have not personally watched prepared, starting now. Myra looked at Rye, who had settled again at the foot of the cot, but not, Myra noticed, with her back fully to the door, angled instead so one eye stayed on it, the old habit of an animal that had spent 12 years learning which threats were worth the energy of worrying about, and had apparently just added a new name to that short list. He touched her, Myra said quietly. He doesn't know what almost happened when he did that. I have a fairly good guess, Ven said, having watched a canopy stalker decide within one meal that it preferred your company to its own instincts. I don't intend to find out what your dog decides about a man who threatens you directly instead of just reaching for her head by accident. And Miss Callahan, for what it's worth, and I understand it isn't much, I don't think you'll have to. I think that's rather the point of her. She doesn't need to do anything. She just needs to be seen deciding not to, in front of the right witness, and men like Talvin start doing the math on what happens the day she decides differently. He left before Myra could answer, posted himself back at the door with the studied blankness of a man on routine duty, and Myra lay back on the cot in the narrow room with her dog's weight warm against her shin, and understood with total clarity that the inquiry board was no longer the most dangerous thing standing between her and going home. The attempt came on the second night, and Myra only understood how close it had come to working by piecing together, afterward, 3 separate accounts that none of the people giving them fully wanted to give. She woke to Rye already standing, already at the door, not rigid this time but coiled. A different quality of alert, lower and more purposeful, the stance she took right before she moved rather than the stance she took while deciding whether to. There was a smell in the room that hadn't been there when Myra fell asleep, faint, sweetish, chemical, wrong in the specific way that made the animal part of her brain sit up a full 2 seconds before the rational part caught up, and identified it as coming from the water jug on the washstand. Rye, leave it. The command was automatic, aimed at the jug more than the dog, because Rye hadn't gone near it, had in fact put herself between Myra and the washstand the moment Myra's eyes opened, which told her everything she needed to know about which of them had smelled it first. Myra didn't touch the water. She didn't touch anything. She sat very still on the edge of the cot with her dog's weight solid against her leg, and did the same thing she'd done for 41 days every time the forest handed her a problem with no good options. She waited, and she listened, and she let the part of her that had gone quiet and animal careful since the crash do the thinking instead of the part that wanted to panic. Outside, past the narrow window slit, she heard it, not close, not threatening exactly, but present in a way the garrison's ordinary night sounds weren't. A low sound, deep enough to feel more than here, moving somewhere beyond the perimeter fencing. Sable's call, the one he made when he'd found something and wanted her to know it, except 3 times the depth and weight of anything Sable's 8-month-old chest could produce. She heard, a few minutes later, running footsteps outside, not toward her door, away from it, fast, and a voice she didn't recognize saying something short and sharp in the clipped cadence of a man reporting a problem he badly wanted to not be his problem. and another voice, further off, that might have been Halk's, asking questions in the tone of someone who already suspected the answers would be bad. Nothing else happened that night. Myra did not sleep. In the morning, Ven came to the door personally instead of sending a rotation guard, and his crest was so flattened against his skull that Myra understood, before he said a word, that whatever had happened had confirmed every suspicion he'd voiced 2 nights before. "The water jug's been removed for testing," he said. "Standard procedure would have had it replaced without comment, and I want you to understand that the fact I'm telling you otherwise is me choosing, deliberately, not to follow standard procedure anymore." "What was in it?" "I don't know yet. I know it wasn't there at the last watch change, and I know the guard on that rotation has since reported that he stepped away from his post for approximately 4 minutes at Requisitions Officer Talvin's specific request, to help retrieve a supply manifest from the perimeter store, a task that did not, on review, require his presence at all, and that Talvin has since claimed to have no memory of requesting." Ven's voice was very level, the level of a man holding it there by force. "I also know that the perimeter fence's east motion sensors logged something large moving along the outer boundary at roughly the same time, close enough to trip 3 separate alerts, and that whatever it was left the boundary intact and moved off without triggering a 4th. Security review is calling it an equipment malfunction." "It's not an equipment malfunction." "No," Ven agreed. "I don't believe it is. I believe something very large came within 30 meters of this garrison's fence line last night, for reasons I do not fully understand, at almost exactly the hour someone tried to interfere with your water supply. I am not prepared to call that a coincidence, and I am not prepared to pretend I understand the mechanism by which it isn't one. I only know that whatever is happening in that forest, it appears to have opinions about your safety that extend rather further than your dog's patience with a stranger's hand." Myra sat with that for a long moment, thinking of 2 sounds heard twice in 6 weeks, big, slow patrolling, never closer than 200 meters, and of Yarrow's story of something at the forest's dead center that made everything else look like a stray cat, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite comfort but some cold, clear cousin of both. "Talvin's not going to try that again," she said. "Not the same way." "No," Ven said. "Which is precisely why I think you need to stop treating the inquiry board as a formality to survive until you can go home, and start treating it as the only forum left where the truth can be put on record loud enough that killing you stops being useful to anyone. Halk has finished the manifest cross-reference. 11 deaths, 11 matching pelt entries, going back 9 years, 3 years further than your 6-year exclusion order, which means whoever set that boundary knew, at minimum, that there was already a pattern worth hiding before they ever drew the line on the map. She's prepared to testify. I'm prepared to testify. Yarrow, I believe, has been waiting 14 years for someone to ask him to testify. What we don't have is you, a living witness who walked in and came out again without a scratch, which is the one piece of evidence that makes Predator Strike tragic. Don't go past the line, impossible to keep saying with a straight face." "Bethrin convenes the board." "Bethrin chairs the board," Ven corrected. "He does not decide its findings alone. Coalition regulation requires 2 additional officers of record and a civilian observer for any inquiry touching an exclusion zone incident with fatalities on the historical record. I've already submitted the paperwork requesting Yarrow as that civilian observer. Bethrin can slow the process. I don't believe, not anymore, that he can stop it outright without making himself look considerably guiltier than a delay would." Myra looked down at Rye, who had settled again at the foot of the cot with her chin on her paws, watching the door with one half-lidded eye, the unbothered posture of an animal that had already decided the immediate danger had passed, and saw no reason to spend energy worrying about a threat that wasn't currently in the room. It was, Myra thought, the single most reassuring thing in the building, and she'd learned over 12 years to trust that instinct over almost anyone's spoken reassurance, including her own. 2 days, she said. 2 days, Ven agreed. I'd suggest you spend them thinking very carefully about exactly what you intend to say, and to whom, and in what order, because I don't believe Bethren's going to give you a second chance to say it clean. He was right, though not in the way either of them expected, because the inquiry board convened a full day early, called on short notice by a warden marshal who had apparently decided that a controlled early hearing, on his terms in his room, was a considerably better outcome than a delayed one that gave his witnesses more time to compare notes. Myra found out with 2 hours' warning and no time at all to prepare a version of the truth that was anything other than exactly, plainly what had happened. In the end, she decided, sitting on the edge of the cot with Rye's head heavy and warm against her knee, that was probably for the best. She had spent 6 weeks learning that the forest rewarded plain truths and punished performances. She saw no reason the garrison would prove any different. The hearing room was the largest space in the administrative dome, a hall usually reserved for garrison assemblies, and someone had arranged it with the particular sterile formality of a proceeding meant to look thorough while moving as fast as possible. A long table at the front for the board, Bethren at its center, flanked by 2 officers Myra didn't recognize, and an empty chair at the end that Ven's petition had apparently won after all, because Desmond Yarrow walked in 3 minutes before the proceeding opened and took it without asking anyone's permission. Talvin sat in the gallery, not as a witness of record but as an observer withstanding to submit questions through the board. A courtesy, Myra learned later, that Bethren himself had authorized, and that told her plainly enough which side of this proceeding the warden marshal still believed he was protecting. Rye lay at Myra's feet beneath the witness table, and for the first time since the clearing, Myra watched Bethren's eyes go to the dog before they went to her, cataloging something, and understood that whatever calculation he'd been running for 4 days hadn't finished running yet. Miss Callahan. Bethren's voice carried the flat, formal cadence of a man reading from a script he'd rehearsed. This board convenes to establish the facts surrounding your survival within exclusion zone Theta-9 and to determine what corrective findings, if any, arise from that survival. You'll understand the gravity of the matter. 11 confirmed fatalities inform this zone's current designation. Your account, if accepted without scrutiny, would call that designation, and by extension, 6 years of this garrison's policy, into serious question. My account is what happened, Myra said. I'm not asking you to accept it without scrutiny. I'm asking you to scrutinize it against the evidence, instead of against how inconvenient it is. One of the flanking officers, younger, closer to Ven's age, a Vantic woman whose crest markings Myra didn't yet know how to read, allowed herself something that wasn't quite a smile. Bethren did not. Then let's begin with the account, Bethren said. In full from the crash. Myra gave it plainly, the way she'd given it to Yarrow over 2 mugs of something hot, the way she'd given it to herself in the dark for 41 nights before anyone else was there to hear it. The raider fire, the skiff going down hard along the northern tree line, the 4 days of shock and rationing before she understood no rescue was coming because none had been sent, the slow, terrified education of learning which plants didn't kill her, and which sounds meant retreat and which meant curiosity, and the night in week 3 when a young canopy stalker had circled her fire twice, and then simply lain down at the edge of the light and stayed. I didn't tame him, she said, when one of the board officers pressed the word. I don't think you tame something like that. I think you stop being a threat, and you keep not being a threat consistently for long enough that the animal's own risk calculation changes. That's not a technique. That's just what patience looks like from the outside. And the larger organism, Bethren said, the one Yarrow's testimony and your own logbook both reference. You're asking this board to believe an unconfirmed apex predator, larger than anything on record for this planet, has also, what? Decided not to eat you. I'm not asking you to believe anything about it, Myra said. I've seen sign of it twice, heard it twice, never closer than 200 meters in 6 weeks. I don't know what it's decided about me, if it's decided anything at all. I know that whatever attacked those 11 people wasn't behaving the way anything in that forest has ever behaved toward me. And I think the difference is worth this board's attention a great deal more than my personal credibility is. Talvin, from the gallery, raised a hand with the smooth confidence of a man who'd been granted the privilege in advance. Bethrin recognized him with a nod that came a half-second too fast to look neutral. "A question, if the board will permit," Talvin said. "Miss Callahan, isn't it true that extended isolation, malnutrition, and acute psychological stress are well documented to produce exactly this kind of narrative? A survivor's mind imposing pattern and safety on genuinely random, dangerous events, because the alternative, that she survived through nothing but luck, is unbearable. I don't say this to attack your character. I say it because this board has a responsibility to weigh testimony against the very real possibility that trauma has reshaped your account without your knowledge." It was, Myra had to admit, watching him say it, a well-built trap, reasonable sounding, compassionate sounding, built to make any answer she gave look like exactly the kind of defensive certainty a traumatized mind would produce. She felt the room's attention shift toward her, weighing, and understood that this was the moment Talvin had been waiting 3 days to build. She didn't answer him. She looked down instead, at Rye, who had lifted her head at the change in the room's tension the way she always did, ears forward, reading the temperature of a conversation she couldn't follow in words, but had clearly followed in every way that mattered. "Rye's 12 years old," Myra said to the board, not to Talvin. "She's not traumatized. She wasn't in that skiff when it went down. I found her waiting at the wreck site 2 days after the crash, because she'd apparently walked the 8 kilometers from the landing pad on her own, rather than accept being kennelled with strangers while I was in the air. She's not malnourished, she's not stressed, and she has spent 6 weeks watching every single animal I've described walk into that clearing and choose not to hurt either of us. If you want to tell this board that my account is a trauma narrative, you're going to have to explain why my dog's been agreeing with it the entire time, because animals don't perform reassurance for an audience. They don't know there's an audience. She's not telling a story. She's just not afraid, and she has excellent reasons not to be. And I'd trust her judgment on this a great deal further than I'd trust yours, Mr. Talvin, given that you've had considerably more reason these last 4 days to want this board hearing something other than the truth." The room went very still. Yarrow, at the end of the board table, made a small sound that might have been a laugh he swallowed halfway. Bethrin's jaw worked once, and the Vantic officer beside him leaned very slightly forward, and Talvin's smooth expression held for exactly 1 second too long before something underneath it flickered. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Callahan," Bethrin said carefully. "It's a serious situation, Marshal," Myra said. "Corporal Houck has spent 4 days cross-referencing my sighting logs against 9 years of exchange post manifests. Corporal Venn has 3 prior incident reports on pelt shipments that don't match legal hunt records, all closed within a week as administrative errors. 2 nights ago, someone tried to introduce a contaminant into my drinking water during a 4-minute gap in my guard rotation that Mr. Talvin personally arranged. I'm not asking this board to take my word for any of that. I'm asking you to pull the records and look, because I think you'll find the pattern was there years before I ever fell out of the sky into it." Talvin was on his feet now, composure fraying at its edges into something sharper. This is exactly the kind of paranoid escalation trauma survivors. The door at the back of the hall opened hard enough to hit the wall, and a warden Myra didn't recognize came through it at a dead run, breathless, saluting Bethrin with a hand that was shaking. Marshal, perimeters reporting multiple large contacts at the north fence line, moving in from the tree line. No aggressive posture logged, but they're not stopping at the boundary markers either. Sensors are calling it a mixed group, at least 6 individual signatures, and sir, one of the readings is off the scale entirely. Bigger than anything in the zoological database. It's coming straight for the garrison. Every head in the room turned, and Myra felt Rye rise beside her. Not alarmed, not tense in the coiled predatory way she'd shown 2 nights before. Simply attentive, ears forward, tail giving one slow, unmistakable sweep against the floor. The exact gesture she made at the wreck site every evening at the sound of a particular set of footsteps coming home. "That's Sable," Myra said quietly, into the sudden chaos of officers reaching for comms and weapons. "He's never come this close to the boundary before. Something's brought him here on purpose." Bethren's eyes found hers across the hearing room, and for the first time since the clearing, Myra watched something in his face that wasn't authority or suspicion or careful political calculation. It was, plainly, fear, and underneath the fear, the first flicker of a man realizing the story he'd spent 6 years defending was about to walk up to his own front door and prove itself in front of every witness he had. The hearing room emptied in under a minute, board and gallery and guards alike pouring out into the garrison's central yard, and Myra went with them because nobody tried very hard to stop her, and because Rye was already moving toward the north fence at a pace that made staying behind feel less like caution and more like abandonment. The perimeter lights had come up to full brightness, throwing the fence line into stark white relief against the dark tree line beyond it, and by the time Myra reached the yard she could see them clearly. 6 shapes at the boundary, none of them advancing past the marked perimeter, all of them holding at a loose, uneven line the way animals hold when they're waiting rather than hunting. Sable was closest, pacing a short arc just outside the fence, throat working with the low call Myra had heard through her window 2 nights before, except now she understood it wasn't a threat display. It was closer, she thought, to the sound Rye made at the door when Myra came home late, not a warning, an announcement. Behind him, further back in the tree shadow, 2 more shapes she didn't recognize, smaller, lower to the ground, moving in the quick nervous pattern of animals well outside their comfort but unwilling to leave whatever had brought them there. And behind all of them, filling the gap between 2 black-barked trees with a silhouette that made every warden on the fence line go absolutely silent, something that made Sable look, for the first time since Myra had known him, genuinely small. It didn't move like the others. It stood at the tree line's edge with an economy of motion that belonged to something that had never once in its life needed to hurry, head low and level, a ridge of pale, bristled fur running the length of a spine that put its shoulder height somewhere well above a standing man's. Myra felt her breath catch despite herself. 6 weeks of careful calm burning off in an instant at the simple animal recognition of scale, of a predator that made every other threat she'd survived look like a warm-up. "Hold fire," Bethren's voice cut across the yard, sharp, to a line of wardens who had weapons half raised and were visibly fighting the urge to raise them the rest of the way. "Nobody fires without my order." "Nobody." "Sir, that signature is—" "I said hold." Bethren's voice cracked like a whip, and Myra understood, watching him, that whatever calculation had been running behind his eyes in the hearing room had finished, and had landed somewhere she hadn't expected. He was afraid. He was also, for the first time since the clearing, not hiding behind procedure to avoid dealing with what was actually in front of him. Myra didn't wait for permission. She walked toward the fence, slow, hands visible, the same language she'd used on every stranger and every animal for 6 weeks running, and heard Ven's voice behind her, urgent, not quite an order because he no longer had the standing to give her one. "Miss Callahan." "He came to me," Myra said, not stopping. "Something brought 6 animals to a fence line they've never crossed in 6 years of this garrison's existence, and the one in front is a kid I've been feeding stew to for 3 weeks. If anyone's walking toward that fence, it should be someone he already trusts not to shoot him. Nobody stopped her. She reached the fence line with Rye at her knee, unhurried, matching her pace exactly the way she had every morning at the wreck site, and stood at the boundary marker with 600 residents of Bramlow Landing watching from behind her, and a shape at the far tree line that could have flattened the perimeter fence without slowing down. "Hey," she said to Sable, quiet, the same voice she'd have used across a campfire. "You weren't supposed to come this far." Sable's pacing stopped. He came to the fence, not through it, not over it, simply to it, and lowered his long skull until it was level with the top rail, and made the low chuffing sound Myra had learned meant something between greeting and request. Behind him, the two smaller shapes edged closer, and one of them, in the perimeter lighting, resolved into a form Myra recognized from her logbook sketches. A Vren stalker, antlered, easily the size of a draft horse, standing with its weight shifted uneasily off its front legs the way a nervous animal stands when it's decided the risk is worth taking, but hasn't finished convincing itself. "They followed you," Myra said, half to herself, half to the massive shape still holding at the tree line's edge, unmoving, watching. "You didn't bring them. They followed you here because you weren't scared, and that's apparently all it takes." Behind her she heard Bethren's voice, lower now, directed at the officer beside him rather than the yard at large. "Get a recording feed running, all of it. Whatever happens in the next 5 minutes, I want it on permanent record, because no inquiry board in this sector is going to believe a written report." The massive shape at the tree line moved for the first time since Myra had reached the fence, not toward her, not toward the garrison, but sideways, a slow, deliberate half-circle that brought it fully out of the tree's shadow and into the reach of the perimeter lights for the first time in what Myra understood, from the collective indrawn breath behind her, was likely the first time in the garrison's entire history that anyone had laid eyes on it and lived to describe it afterward. It was extraordinary, and it was terrible, and it was, Myra thought, taking in the pale-ridged fur, the low, deep-set eyes that caught the perimeter light and threw it back amber, the sheer patient economy of its movement, unmistakably the same animal grammar she'd spent 6 weeks learning to read in creatures a tenth its size. It was not hunting. Its ears, long, mobile, currently canted forward in an attitude of simple attention, were not the ears of something stalking. It had come to look, the way Sable had come to look 3 weeks into her exile, and it was, for one long suspended moment, simply looking. Myra crouched slowly to rise level, and put a hand flat on the dog's shoulder, not restraint, just contact, just the small physical anchor of "I'm here too," and Rye, for her part, sat, and looked back across the fence at something 40 times her size with an expression of total, unhurried unconcern that Myra would later think was the single bravest thing she had ever watched a living creature do. "She's not a threat to you," Myra said to the massive shape, knowing it couldn't understand a word and saying it anyway, because 6 weeks alone had taught her that sometimes the words weren't for the animal at all. "None of us are. I don't know what you want. I don't know what you've decided about any of this. But nobody here is going to hurt you unless you make them think they have to. And I promise you, on my dog's life, I will do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen." The matriarch, Myra, would only start calling her that afterward, once Yarrow's half-legend had a face to attach itself to, held the stare for another handful of seconds, long enough that Myra heard at least one warden behind her make a small, strangled sound of pure nerve endings giving out. Then, unhurried, she lowered her great head, not in submission exactly, nothing about the gesture read as submission, but in something closer to the acknowledgement one apex predator gives another when a territory dispute has been quietly, mutually decided not to happen. She turned, folding that vast frame back into the tree shadow with a silence that seemed impossible for something her size, and the 2 Vren stalkers went with her, and after one last low call toward Myra, an announcement still, not a threat, Sable went too. The yard stayed dead silent for a full 10 seconds after the last shape vanished into the dark. Then it broke into chaos, but a different chaos than Myra had expected, not panic, not the scramble for weapons she'd braced for, but 100 low, urgent conversations breaking out at once, officers turning to each other, to their recording feeds, to the sheer scale of what 6 years of policy had apparently gotten backward. Bethrin reached the fence a moment later, and Myra turned to find him looking not at her but at the tree line, at the space where something the size of a small building had just chosen, in front of his entire garrison, not to become a very short and very bloody story. "You said something brought them here," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the flat, rehearsed authority he'd walked into the hearing room with. "You don't know what?" "I have a guess," Myra said. "I think somebody tried to poison me 2 nights ago, and I think whatever's running that forest noticed, the same way it noticed 11 bodies over 9 years that didn't match the pattern of everything else living out there. I think it came to see for itself whether the thing threatening me was still a problem, and I think it's still deciding." She looked past him, to where Talvin stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, considerably paler than he'd been in the hearing room, and watched the man's eyes move once to the tree line, and then, fast, toward the garrison's transport apron beyond it, the calculating look of a man doing math on how much runway he had left before the story he'd spent 9 years protecting collapsed entirely on top of him. "Marshal," Myra said, quiet, not taking her eyes off Talvin, "I'd suggest someone secure the transport apron. Now. Before whatever's left of his patience runs out too." Talvin ran, which told everyone watching everything they needed to know, and did more to convict him in the space of 30 seconds than 9 years of buried incident reports had managed on their own. He didn't get far. The transport apron sat at the garrison's south edge, 400 meters from the north fence where the whole yard's attention had been fixed, and he made it perhaps halfway there before 2 wardens Halk had positioned on her own initiative. Because, she said later, she'd read enough of Myra's logbook to know exactly what kind of man tried to leave quietly in the middle of a crisis he'd caused, cut him off at the edge of the maintenance yard. He didn't fight them. Myra heard about the rest of it secondhand, from Ven, an hour later, in the flat, careful cadence of a man reporting something he still hadn't fully processed himself. That Talvin, cornered between 2 armed wardens and a supply shed, had turned to find a third shape waiting in the shadow past the shed's far corner. Not one of the 6 from the fence line, but something smaller, quicker. One of the pair Myra had glimpsed at her own tree line in the first week of her exile, sitting in the dark with the same unhurried patience Sable showed at a campfire, simply present, simply watching. Close enough that Talvin's nerve had apparently broken entirely on its own, before either warden needed to raise a weapon. Nobody was hurt. That was the detail Ven repeated twice, carefully watching Myra's face while he said it, because he'd clearly understood by then exactly how much that mattered to her. The animal never moved. It didn't need to. Talvin had simply stopped where he stood, hands raised, voice climbing into something well past his professional composure, and let 2 wardens walk him back to a holding cell without further incident, escorted the entire way by something that trotted along at a companionable, unbothered distance, and peeled off into the dark the moment the garrison's gate closed behind him. He kept saying it was watching him specifically, Ven said. Halk asked him what he meant by that, and he wouldn't answer. I think he'd already worked it out for himself, and I think the answer frightened him considerably more than an interrogation would have. It probably was watching him specifically, Myra said. It followed us for 2 days before it decided I wasn't worth eating. I imagine it's had considerably less patience for a man who spent 4 days trying to have me killed quietly. You don't seem troubled by that. I'm not, Myra said and meant it. He's alive. Nobody laid a claw on him. He just found out, the same way I did 6 weeks ago, that being calm and being harmless aren't the same thing, and that the second one is a much worse mistake to make around this forest than the first. Bethrin came to the guest quarters himself that evening alone, without an escort, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before Myra gestured him toward the room's single chair. He didn't sit immediately. He looked instead at Rye, curled now at the foot of the cot in the loose, unbothered sprawl of a dog, who considered the day's excitement thoroughly concluded, and something in his shoulders came down a fraction that Myra hadn't seen since the clearing. "Halk's cross-reference is conclusive," he said, finally sitting. 9 years of manifests, matched against 9 years of exclusion zone incidents, with a consistency that no honest reading of the data can call coincidence. I want you to understand that I did not know the full shape of it. I want you to understand that, and I recognize I have no right to ask you to believe it. But you suspected. I suspected, Bethrin agreed, and the admission seemed to cost him something physical, a weight coming off through the words rather than through his posture. 3 years into this post, I began noticing discrepancies. I chose, each time, to accept the simplest explanation offered to me, because the alternative meant reopening 9 years of settled record, and admitting that this garrison's foundational policy had been protecting a crime instead of a genuine hazard. It was easier to believe the forest was simply what we had always said it was. It is always easier to believe the story that requires nothing further of you. That's not an excuse. No, Bethrin said, it isn't. I'm not offering it as one. I'm offering it because you are, as far as I can determine, the only person in this garrison who has never once asked me for an excuse, and I find I would rather give you the true accounting than a comfortable one. He looked at her directly, crest set low and level, a posture Myra had come to associate, over the past 6 days, with something like sincerity. The inquiry board will reconvene formally within the week, with the coalition regional office notified and a proper independent panel seated. Talvin will answer for what the exchange post's records show, and for what happened to your water 2 nights ago, and I expect, for a great deal more once investigators start pulling threads on 9 years of manifests. I intend to submit my own conduct for review alongside his. Whatever else I've failed at in this post, I don't intend to fail at that. What happens to the forest? It was the question Myra had been circling for 6 days without letting herself ask it directly, and she watched Bethrin turn it over with real care before answering. I don't know yet, he admitted. I know the exclusion designation as it currently stands is no longer defensible, not after tonight, not after a recording feed with 600 witnesses showing what walked up to this garrison's fence line and chose not to become a massacre. I know the coalition regional office is going to have opinions about a resource-rich landmass that has apparently been misclassified as uniformly lethal for 9 years, and I do not trust every one of those opinions to be as patient with what lives in there as you have been. Meaning someone's going to want to exploit it the second the danger's officially downgraded. Meaning, Bethrin said, that the single strongest argument against that happening carelessly is a witness who can demonstrate credibly and repeatedly that the forest's fauna responds to something other than force, and who has, as of tonight, 600 recorded witnesses confirming she isn't lying about it. He held her gaze. I am aware of how that sounds, Miss Callahan. I am not currently in a position to be asking you for favors. I am telling you, plainly, that whatever happens to that forest in the next several months, you are very likely the only person on this planet with the standing to shape it toward something other than a second mistake replacing the first one. Myra looked down at Rye, who had lifted her head at the change in the room's tone and now watched the warden marshal with the same flat, patient attention she'd given every stranger who'd walked into Myra's life over 12 years. Not suspicious exactly, not welcoming either, simply assessing, the way she assessed everything on her own timeline by her own private accounting. I want the logbook back, Myra said. Full copies. Not the original. Halk can keep that for the investigation. I want to be present for whatever policy gets written next, not consulted after the fact and thanked for my trouble. And I want Corporal Ven's incident reports reopened and credited to him properly, because he filed the truth 3 times before anyone was ready to hear it, and that ought to count for something in whatever record this garrison keeps of the next 6 years. That can be arranged. And I want to go back, Myra said, not as a survivor being escorted out for her own protection, as someone with a reason to be there. Sable's still 8 months old. He hasn't finished growing into whatever he's going to be. And I'd rather he finish growing up around someone who feeds him instead of around whoever the Coalition Regional Office decides to send with a research grant and no patience. Bethrin studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, the last of the careful political calculation Myra had watched him carry since the clearing, finally, visibly, let go. I imagine, he said, standing, that after tonight very few people in this garrison are going to have the nerve to tell you no. The reconvened inquiry board took 4 days to assemble properly, and Myra spent every one of them expecting some new complication to arrive and unravel it. A lost record, a reassigned officer, the particular institutional gravity that made inconvenient truths quietly evaporate given enough time. None of it came. If anything, the delay worked in the opposite direction. Word of the North Fence recording had reached the Coalition Regional Office within hours, passed hand to hand through channels no local garrison could quietly bury. And by the time the board reconvened, it did so under the direct observation of a regional compliance officer named Prace Ithful, a slate-gray OSSEC administrator with the unhurried, unimpressed manner of someone who had seen a great many cover-ups in a long career, and had exactly no patience left for another one. I've reviewed the recording feed 11 times, Ithful said, on the first morning, addressing the reconvened board with the particular flatness of someone who found the footage genuinely remarkable and refused to let it show. I have also reviewed 9 years of exchange post manifests, 3 suppressed incident reports filed by Corporal Ven, and a survivor logbook that reads less like trauma and more like the most complete zoological field record this exclusion zone has ever produced. I want to be direct with everyone in this room. The prior finding, that exclusion zone Theta-9 represents an undifferentiated lethal hazard requiring total avoidance, is no longer supportable. What I need from the next 4 days is a clear account of how that finding survived 9 years of contradicting evidence, and who benefited from it surviving that long. It took most of those 4 days. Halk's manifest cross-reference, laid out in full for the first time, drew a straight, damning line between 11 deaths and 11 pelt shipments, 3 years further back than the exclusion order itself. Evidence, Ithful noted dryly, that whoever drafted the original policy had known enough to be worried well before they ever called it protection. Ven's 3 buried incident reports, restored to record with his name properly attached this time, showed a pattern of administrative closure so consistent it read less like error and more like procedure. Yarrow testified for the better part of a full afternoon, plainly, without performance, about a partner he'd helped carry out of the tree line 14 years before, and a manifest he'd been too frightened to mention, until a starving courier walked out of the forest and made silence feel like the more dangerous choice. I don't ask this board for anything on my own account, Yarrow said, near the end of it, his voice steady in a way that Myra understood had cost him considerably. I've had 14 years to live with what I didn't say, and no finding of this board is going to undo that. I ask it for the 11 names on that manifest list, because every one of them deserves a truer record than predator strike, tragic, don't go past the line. And I ask it, if I may say one more thing, for whatever's still living in that forest, because it has apparently spent 9 years being hunted for a crime it never committed, and it still, as of 6 nights ago, chose not to answer that the way it would have been entirely within its rights to answer it. Talvain, for his part, offered exactly the account Myra had expected of him, once the manifest cross-reference made denial mathematically impossible. Not confession, but negotiation, an attempt to trade the names above him in the exchange post's chain for leniency on his own record. Ithval accepted the names with the flat professional courtesy of someone collecting evidence rather than granting favors, and made no promises in return. And Myra watched Talvin's composure, the same smooth affability that had walked into her guest quarters 6 days before with a friendly warning dressed up as concern, finally, completely fail him under cross-examination, until what was left sitting in the hearing room by the 4th day was simply a tired, frightened man who had spent 9 years mistaking a forest's patience for permission. Bethren's own testimony was the shortest and, Myra thought, the hardest for him to give. He did not defend himself. He laid out, in plain administrative language, every discrepancy he'd noticed and set aside over 9 years of command, every convenient closure he'd signed without pushing further, and closed by submitting his own conduct for formal review without being asked to. "I want the record to show," he said at the end of it, "that Miss Callahan's testimony was correct on every material point from the first day she gave it, and that this garrison's leadership, myself specifically included, chose, repeatedly, not to hear it, because hearing it would have required admitting fault we had spent years avoiding. I do not ask this board for leniency. I ask only that whatever finding follows correct the record for the 11 people this garrison failed, and for the one survivor it very nearly failed a 12th time." Ithval's finding, delivered on the morning of the 5th day, ran to 11 dense pages that Myra would read in full only once, months later, and remember most clearly for 3 lines near the end. That exclusion zone Theta 9's fauna demonstrated consistent, verifiable non-aggression towards subjects who did not present a hunting threat. That the zone's historical fatality record correlated overwhelmingly with unauthorized hunting activity rather than unprovoked predation. And that the prior blanket exclusion designation was, effective immediately, revoked and replaced with a restricted access protectorate status pending full ecological survey to be conducted, the findings specified, under the field guidance of the surviving witness whose sustained, non-hostile contact with the zone's apex fauna constitutes the most complete behavioral record currently available to this coalition. Which was, Myra understood reading it aloud in the hearing room with Rye's head resting warm against her boot, the driest possible way of saying the forest was hers to keep watch over now, if she wanted it. The naming committee, because apparently even a coalition regional office found time, amid 9 years of buried crime and a newly revised zoological record, to worry about naming committees, took considerably less time than the inquiry board had, and produced, to Myra's genuine and lasting amusement, the single most self-serious piece of paperwork she encountered in the entire process. A formal Warden Corps protocol document, drafted by a junior officer who had clearly spent the north fence footage taking careful notes, titled Field Contact Protocol 4, De-escalation through sustained provisioning and calm proximity, with a subsection, the part that made even Ithval's flat administrative composure crack, briefly, into something like a smile. Informally designated across 3 separate garrison memos as the Warm Iron Protocol, for the stone-ringed fire that had, by every account collected, started the entire thing. "It's a campfire," Myra told Ven, reading the memo over his shoulder in the mess hall 2 days after the finding, equal parts appalled and delighted. "You've written a 12-page combat doctrine document about a campfire and a pot of stew." "With respect," Ven said, entirely straight-faced, "the Warm Iron Protocol has been directly credited with diffusing what could have been the single largest predator contact incident in this garrison's history. I don't believe It's Just a Campfire is going to survive contact with the regional office's report language. I'd get used to it. They're going to put stew in a doctrine manual." "They already have," Ven said. "Page 9, there's a recommended ratio." Myra laughed for the first time in what felt like months, loud enough that two wardens at the next table glanced over, and Rye, dozing under the bench with her chin on Myra's boot, lifted her head at the sound, decided nothing about it required investigation, and went promptly back to sleep. Which was, Myra thought, watching the room settle back into its ordinary hum around her, as complete an ending as any inquiry board finding could have written. It wasn't the ending, of course. Nothing that simple ever was. But it was, for the first time since a raider's shot had put her skiff into the trees 49 days before, the first morning she woke without needing to calculate how many hours of daylight stood between her and the next thing trying to kill her, and she let herself sit with that plainly, the way she'd learned to sit with everything else the forest had taught her, without dressing it up as more than it was. The survey work began 3 weeks later, and Myra spent most of those 3 weeks doing the one thing nobody at Bramlow Landing had thought to ask her opinion on, building somewhere permanent to do it from. She chose the site herself, a half-day's walk from her original camp, close enough to the forest edge that supply runs from the landing wouldn't require an armed escort every time, far enough in that it sat inside what the new protectorate boundary now called core habitat rather than transitional buffer. Yarrow came out to help her raise the first proper structure, a 2-room timber cabin with a stone chimney he insisted on building himself, over her objections, because a man who'd spent 22 years maintaining traplines apparently did not consider himself retired from manual labor no matter what his knees had to say about it. And by the end of the first month there was a real roof, a real door, a proper fenced garden plot, and a fire pit out front that had, by unanimous and slightly embarrassing consensus among the Warden Corps, become the single most photographed piece of infrastructure on the entire planet. Sable had moved his territory closer within the first week, which Yarrow assured her was itself remarkable. Canopy stalkers were not, by any prior record, an animal that relocated its range for anything short of a food collapse, and had taken, by the second month, to sleeping most nights within sight of the cabin rather than at the tree line's edge, close enough that Rye had stopped bothering to lift her head when he arrived. The two smaller shapes from the first week turned out, once Myra had enough daylight hours and enough of Yarrow's patient naturalist eye to properly observe them, to be a mated pair of what the survey team eventually cataloged as forest floor scavengers, quick and low and mostly nocturnal, who had apparently decided that a homestead with regular kitchen scraps and no interest in trapping them was worth the risk of daylight visibility. Myra named them, with more affection than originality, Salt and Pepper, and neither Yarrow nor the visiting survey scientists ever quite managed to talk her out of it. The matriarch, whose real name, if forest floor apex predators kept names for themselves in any sense a human mind could recognize, remained and would likely always remain unknown, did not move her range. She did not need to. Her territory, the survey team determined after 6 careful weeks of tracking sign without ever once attempting direct contact, already encompassed the cabin site entirely, had likely encompassed the original camp from the very first night Myra lit a fire inside it, and the closest anyone came to understanding her presence was Yarrow's dry observation, delivered over dinner in the cabin's second month. That a creature with no natural predators and 9 years of patient grievance against every hunter who'd ever violated her ground had apparently decided, for reasons her own kind would never fully explain to Myra's, that a woman who fed strangers and never once raised a weapon was worth watching over rather than watching for. She showed herself perhaps once every 10 days, always at distance, always at dusk, never closer than the tree line's first rank of trunks. A presence rather than a visit, Myra came to think of it, the animal equivalent of a landlord's slow circuit of a property she had no intention of interfering with as long as it kept being tended properly. The trouble, when it came again, came from where Myra had learned to expect it, not from the forest, but from the people who still hadn't finished believing the forest could be trusted. It arrived in the shape of a survey subcontractor named Dral Kessing, an OSEC resource assessor attached to the regional office's ecological team, who arrived at the cabin in the 9th week with a full escort, a set of extraction permits Myra had never seen before, and the particular brisk confidence of a man who had read Ithval's finding and concluded, entirely on his own authority. That restricted access protectorate left considerably more room for interpretation than the finding's author had intended. Timber and mineral survey, Kessing said, laying the permits on the cabin's front step with the flat efficiency of a man who did not expect to be questioned. Standard resource assessment for any newly reclassified zone, Miss Callahan. Nothing extractive, purely evaluative core samples, growth ring dating, subsurface density mapping. My team requires access to the deep interior, specifically the region your survey notes list as core apex territory, since that's precisely the terrain profile we need to sample. The deep interior's not open, Myra said, not moving from the doorway. That's the whole point of the finding. Restricted access means restricted, not restricted except for people with a permit I've never approved. The permit's approved at the regional office, Kessing said, patient in the way of a man reciting a fact he considered self-evidently final. Your role, as I understand the finding's language, is advisory. I have every intention of proceeding carefully, and every respect for the behavioral protocol your work has established. But I do have a legal instrument here, Miss Callahan, and I would prefer not to need to invoke it. He had 6 people with him, all carrying equipment rather than weapons, which told Myra something about the man's genuine intentions even as it told her nothing about his judgment. And he set off toward the tree line an hour later with the calm, procedural confidence of someone who had never once had to learn, the hard, slow way she had, exactly how thin the margin was between an animal's patience and its limit. Myra went after them, because she'd learned that lesson and he hadn't, and because Rye was already moving before Myra had finished deciding to follow, low and purposeful, the exact gait she used when a decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was whether the humans around her would catch up in time to matter. She caught Kessing's team 40 minutes in, well past the boundary marker Myra herself still treated as a courtesy rather than a barrier, deep enough into the deep interior that the canopy had closed overhead into the particular green-black dimness that meant they were standing, whether the survey team understood it or not. Inside the innermost ring of territory, the matriarch had held, patiently, defended, and never once needed to fight for in 9 full years. You need to stop, Myra said, arriving breathless, right now, exactly where you're standing, and not take one more step forward. Miss Callahan, I appreciate your concern, but this team has followed every protocol. You've followed a protocol for animals that behave like your database says they behave, Myra said. You haven't followed the only protocol that's ever actually mattered out here, which is that you don't walk into somewhere you haven't been invited unless you're prepared to be told, very clearly, that you weren't. She was already scanning the tree line as she said it, the old 6 weeks alone instinct fully awake now, cataloging shadow and stillness with the practiced eye of someone who had learned this particular grammar the hard way, and had no intention of one of Kessing's people learning it the same way she had. Everybody stay exactly where you are. Don't raise anything. Don't reach for anything. If something comes into view, you look at me, not at it, and you do exactly what I tell you. Kessing opened his mouth to object, and closed it again when Rye, beside Myra, went suddenly, completely still. Not the coiled readiness of 2 nights at the garrison, not alarm, simply a total stillness that Myra had learned over 12 years to read as the animal equivalent of everyone be quiet. And the entire clearing seemed to absorb the instruction whole. 6 survey technicians and 1 increasingly pale resource assessor going motionless around her without a single further word needing to be said. The matriarch came into the clearing's edge the way she always did, without seeming to have hurried, without a single sound Myra could point to as the moment of her arrival. Simply present, suddenly, at the tree line's dark edge, head low, eyes catching what little light made it through the canopy and throwing it back amber. Nobody moved. Myra didn't move either, though every animal instinct honed over 6 weeks of survival wanted very badly to put herself physically between the assessment team and 800 kilograms of patient, aggrieved apex predator, standing at the edge of ground it had defended, alone, for 9 years against exactly this kind of casual trespass. "This is her territory," Myra said, quiet, not taking her eyes off the tree line. "Not the Protectorate boundaries territory. Not the findings territory. Hers. She's tolerated a lot from my species in the last 2 months because I asked her to, patiently, one fed animal and one honest fire at a time, and I am not going to spend that patience on a mineral survey she never agreed to." "Miss Callahan," Kessing's voice had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. "Don't run," Myra said, cutting him off flat. "Whatever you do, do not run. Running is the only thing in 6 weeks I've ever seen this forest genuinely respond to badly, and I would very much like your entire team to still have all their limbs when we walk back out of here." The matriarch held the clearing's edge for a long, taut minute, and Myra watched her weigh 6 strangers with equipment against a woman standing calm and empty-handed in front of them. The same calculation Myra had watched a dozen smaller animals run in the 6 weeks since the crash, scaled up now to something that made the ground itself feel like it was holding its breath. Then, exactly as she had at the garrison fence 8 weeks before, she lowered her head, turned, and withdrew into the tree shadow without a sound. Not an attack, not even a threat display, simply a slow, absolute, wordless withdrawal of permission. And Myra understood, watching her go, that it had cost the animal nothing at all to make that choice, because she had never once needed force to make her point. Her stillness had been the entire argument. "We're leaving," Myra said, into the silence that followed, "right now, and I'm walking your entire team back to the boundary marker myself. And Mr. Kessing, when we get there, you are going to help me draft an amendment to that findings language that makes restricted mean something a permit can't argue its way around, because I am not doing this again." Kessing, considerably paler and considerably quieter than he'd arrived, did not argue. The amendment took less time to draft than the original finding had, mostly because Ithful, briefed on the incident within a day by a considerably more contrite Drow Kessing, arrived in person to oversee it rather than trust the language to another committee. "Core Apex Territory," Ithful read aloud, standing in the cabin's front room with the amended draft in hand, Rye dozing at the hearth, and the afternoon light coming warm and gold through the single window Yarrow had fitted with real glass, instead of the oiled hide Myra had first stretched across the frame. "Access absolutely prohibited without direct field clearance from the designated Protectorate liaison, permit language notwithstanding, no exceptions for research, resource assessment, or administrative convenience." The OSSEC administrator's flat professional expression didn't change, but something in the set of the antennae shifted that Myra had learned, over 2 months of dealing with regional office correspondence, to read as approval. "I understand Mr. Kessing found the field conditions considerably more persuasive than the written finding." "He found 800 kilograms of apex predator considerably more persuasive," Myra said. "I'd rather the language be persuasive enough that nobody else needs the demonstration." "A reasonable ambition." Ithful set the draft down and looked at her with the particular directness Myra had come to appreciate in the administrator over 2 months of correspondence. No wasted courtesy, no performed warmth, just plain assessment. "May I ask you something outside the findings language, Miss Callahan?" "Go ahead." 9 years of buried evidence, 11 deaths. A poaching operation that reached, we now believe, as high as 3 regional trade officials who will be answering for it considerably more slowly than Talvin already has. An apex predator with every reasonable justification for treating this entire species as a threat to be eliminated on sight. Ithful's antennae stilled entirely which Myra had learned meant the question mattered. You arrived here with nothing. A knife, a fire starter, and a dog. You are, by any honest accounting, the reason any of this came to light at all, and the reason it resolved without a second massacre. I have reviewed a great many first contact and territorial conflict resolutions in a long career, Miss Callahan, involving considerably better resource negotiators than a stranded courier with a cookpot. I would genuinely like to understand what you believe made the difference. Myra thought about it longer than the question probably required, watching Rye's ribs rise and fall in front of the hearth, thinking of 41 days alone with nothing but patience and hunger to teach her, of Sable's slow, cautious approach across 3 full weeks, of a matriarch who had chosen, twice now, not to make a point she had every right to make. I didn't do anything clever, she said finally. I got shot down and I was scared and I was alone, and instead of treating everything out there like a threat to be managed, I just stopped being one myself because I didn't have the strength left to be anything else. I fed what came close. I didn't chase what ran. I let them decide on their own timeline whether I was worth the risk of trusting, instead of trying to convince them faster than they were ready to be convinced. She looked up at Ithfel. I think that's the whole difference, honestly. Everybody who died out here died trying to take something from this forest by force. I never took anything. I just made a fire and waited to see who wanted to sit at it. Turns out that's not nothing. It's just not the kind of thing anyone puts in a resource assessment. It's in this one, Ithfel said, dry, tapping the amended draft. Page 9, I believe. Something about a recommended stew ratio. Myra laughed despite herself, and Rye's ear twitched at the hearth without the rest of her stirring, and Ithfel's antennae did the thing that, on an Osek face, Myra had learned to recognize finally as genuine amusement. The weeks that followed settled into something Myra hadn't quite dared to imagine during the worst of the 41 days alone. A rhythm. Survey work in the mornings, with Yarrow's steady naturalist eye cataloging behavior patterns that would, within the year, become the foundation of the first honest field guide the region had ever produced for Theta 9's fauna. Supply runs to Bramlow Landing every 10 days, where Venn, promoted quietly, to a liaison post of his own creation that mostly consisted of making sure nobody in the garrison forgot what 4 years of buried reports had cost, had taken to walking her partway back into the tree line each time, less out of duty now than out of something that had become, without either of them quite naming it, friendship. Evenings at the cabin, where Sable had taken to lying close enough to the fire that Rye occasionally, grudgingly, shared the warm stone hearthage with him, 2 very different apex animals dozing 3 feet apart with the mutual indifference of old housemates. The matriarch never came to the cabin directly. She didn't need to. But twice more that season at dusk, Myra caught her silhouette at the tree line's edge, watching unhurried, and each time simply raised a hand. Not a wave exactly, nothing so performative, just an acknowledgement, the same one she'd give a neighbor across a fence line. And each time the great pale ridge shape held a moment longer before withdrawing, and Myra came slowly to understand that this was very likely the entire relationship they would ever have, and that it was, in its own patient way, enough. The poaching investigation widened through the winter, exactly as Ithfel had predicted, pulling in 2 more trade officials and a shipping contact 3 systems over, and Talvin's own hearing, when it finally concluded, resulted in a sentence Myra heard about second-hand from Halk and found she had almost no strong feelings about it all. Not satisfaction, not mercy, just the flat administrative closing of a chapter that had already cost what it was going to cost and could not now cost any more. Bethren's review concluded with a formal reprimand and a reassignment to a considerably smaller, considerably quieter posting 3 systems away, which he accepted, then reported, without argument and with something that had looked almost like relief. He asked me to give you something before he shipped out, Venn said, on one of the 10-day supply runs, handing Myra a small, worn logbook of his own, Bethren's. She realized, flipping it open, page after page of a command officer's private notes going back 9 years, discrepancies flagged and then, again and again, quietly dismissed. He said you'd understand it better than anyone else what it cost him to finally stop dismissing them. He said to tell you he was sorry it took a stranger with a cookpot to make him do the job he'd been paid 9 years to do. Myra closed the logbook slowly and set it on the cabin shelf beside her own, 2 records of the same 9 years told from opposite ends of a very long silence, and didn't say anything for a while, and then, to his credit, let her not say anything, and simply sat with her at the fire until the light went fully down, and Sable's low evening call rose somewhere out past the tree line, unhurried, unafraid, exactly on schedule. The formal Protectorate inauguration was scheduled for the first thaw of the following season, and Myra argued against holding it at the cabin for 3 weeks before finally losing the argument to Ithval's flat, patient insistence that a ceremony held anywhere else would defeat the entire point of what the finding was trying to establish. The Coalition Regional Assembly wants to see the site, Ithval said, over a correspondence packet thick enough that Myra had taken to reading it in installments over dinner. Not a report about the site, not a recording of the site, the actual ground with the actual witness standing where it happened. There is a faction within the assembly, vocal, and I will not pretend otherwise, that still believes Theta 9's reclassification was premature, driven by sentiment rather than evidence. A ceremony held anywhere else lets that faction keep believing it's mostly a story. I would like them to stand in the clearing instead. So they came, on the first clear morning after the thaw. A full coalition delegation, 11 officials from 6-member species, a recording crew, an honor detachment from the regional garrison that Bethren's replacement had insisted on despite Myra's objections, and at the delegation's center, a broad-shouldered Vantic officer named Marshal Envoy Korik Don, a decorated attaché from the Assembly's Military Oversight Committee, whose skepticism had, by Ithval's account, driven most of the faction's resistance from the start. He arrived already unimpressed, which Myra understood within the first 5 minutes of meeting him, was less a judgment on her specifically than a settled worldview he'd carried into the clearing fully formed. He surveyed the cabin, the fenced garden, the stone hearth, the modest fire Myra had built that morning more out of habit than necessity, with the polite, contained disdain of a man who had built his career on the assumption that any threat worth respecting announced itself with force, and found nothing in front of him that met that standard. "This is the animal," he said, when Rye came out to greet the delegation with her usual unhurried curiosity, sniffing once at the nearest official's boots and settling at Myra's side. The one the finding credits with de-escalating a multi-species territorial incident. "That's Rye," Myra said. "She didn't de-escalate anything specifically. She's just been doing what she's always done, and the rest of the forest noticed." "She's a domestic animal," Don said, crouching, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of a man examining evidence he'd already decided was insufficient. 12 years old by your own record, modest musculature, no visible weaponry beyond ordinary dentition. I've reviewed the findings language extensively, Miss Callahan, and I confess I remain unconvinced that an animal of this profile could meaningfully influence the behavior of a Class 9 apex predator, let alone whatever unclassified organism your report describes at the territory's core. I suspect what actually happened here is considerably simpler than the finding wants to admit, a fortunate absence of provocation, misread as trust. Rye, for her part, sat through this entire assessment with the flat, patient indifference of an animal who had heard variations of it from a dozen strangers over 12 years, and found none of them worth losing sleep over, tail giving one slow, unbothered sweep across the dirt when Don finally stood. "With respect, Marshal Envoy," Myra said, "I don't need you to be convinced by looking at her. I needed the finding to be convinced by what happened, and it was." Recordings can be selectively framed, Don said. I mean no insult to your integrity, Miss Callahan. I simply hold a different standard of evidence than a single night's footage. He glanced toward the tree line, where the morning light lay pale and thin through the still bare canopy. I understand the larger organism has shown itself to observers before. I would find that considerably more persuasive than a dog's temperament if it were willing to demonstrate for this delegation directly. She doesn't perform, Myra said. None of them do. That's rather the entire point I've spent a year trying to explain. It was, in the end, not Myra's explanation that answered him. It was a mistake. Small, careless. The kind Myra had learned over a year to recognize as the exact species of error that had gotten 11 people killed before her. And that Don, for all his careful skepticism, made without a moment's thought, reaching down as he straightened to give Rye's head the same brisk, dismissive pat he might have given a service animal he considered beneath serious regard. Rye didn't growl, she didn't need to. She simply held the same flat, total stillness Myra had watched stop a restraint cable in a poisoner's hand, and months later, an entire survey team dead in their tracks, and somewhere past the tree line, close enough that every member of the delegation heard it and several of them visibly startled. A low call rose that Myra recognized instantly as Sable's, except it wasn't only Sable's. A second voice answered it, then a third, overlapping, closer, and Myra felt the ground itself seem to draw a breath as the whole clearing's edge came alive with movement. Marshal Envoy, Myra said quietly, not moving. I'd suggest you take your hand off my dog's head and stand very still, because I think you're about to get exactly the demonstration you asked for, and I want you to still have both eyes to see it with. Sable broke from the tree line first, no longer the lean 8-month juvenile of the year before but a full-grown adult now, easily the size of a draft horse himself, moving with a controlled, unhurried purpose that stopped every honor guard's hand halfway to a weapon. Behind him came Salt and Pepper, low and quick, and behind them 2 more shapes Myra didn't recognize by name but recognized by grammar, young, cautious, drawn by the same low calls, the same current of information passing animal to animal in a language none of the assembled officials had a translator for. Vren stalkers broke cover at the clearing's far edge, 3 of them this time, antlers catching the pale morning light, holding at a respectful distance with the loose, uneven line Myra remembered from the garrison fence 8 months before. And behind all of them, unhurried, immense, the pale ridge of fur along her spine catching the thin sunlight like frost, the matriarch came to the tree line's edge and stopped, and looked, not at Myra this time, but directly at the man whose hand still hovered, frozen, an inch above a dog's skull. Nobody in the delegation moved. Nobody breathed, as far as Myra could tell, for the better part of a full minute, while 6 different apex species held the clearing's perimeter in a loose, patient ring around 11 officials, 1 recording crew, an honor detachment with their weapons very deliberately not raised, and 1 martial envoy whose careful skepticism had just been answered by something considerably more persuasive than a recording. They came because you touched her without asking, Myra said, into the silence, keeping her own voice as level and unhurried as she'd learned over a year that this forest required. Not to hurt you. If they wanted to hurt you, Marshal Envoy, you'd already know it, and so would every person standing behind you. They came because word travels fast out here when something happens near me, and because every one of them has spent the last year learning that I don't let strangers put a hand on what's mine without at least announcing themselves first. That's not aggression. That's the same courtesy you'd expect walking into anyone's home uninvited. You just haven't had to learn that lesson from this side of it before. Don lowered his hand, slowly, deliberately, the way Myra had watched Talvin do it 8 months before in a room considerably smaller than this one. And for a long moment, he simply looked around the clearing at the ring of patient, watching apex predators who had, between one breath and the next, made his entire skeptical faction's argument obsolete in front of 11 witnesses and a full recording crew. "I withdraw my objection," he said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of the contained disdain he'd arrived with. "To the finding, to all of it. I would ask, if I may, Miss Callahan, is it customary on your world to apologize to the animal directly?" Myra felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight since the moment his hand had touched Rye's head, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she was smiling. "It's customary everywhere I've ever lived," she said. "She'll forgive you. She's not one to hold a grudge, but I'd make it sincere if I were you. She reads tone better than most people I've met." Don crouched again, slower this time, and extended one open palm, not toward Rye's head this time, but low, patient, an offering rather than a claim, exactly the way Myra had taught 6 months of visiting officials to approach any animal on this ground that mattered to her. Rye considered it for a long moment with her usual flat patience, then leaned forward and pressed her nose once against his palm, and the entire clearing, predator and delegate alike, seemed to exhale at once. Behind them, at the tree line, the matriarch held the moment a heartbeat longer, and then, unhurried, lowered her great head in the same slow acknowledgment she'd given Myra 8 months before, and withdrew. And the rest of the forest's watching apex went with her, back into the pale spring shadow, leaving the clearing exactly as quiet and exactly as ordinary as it had been an hour before, as though 6 of the most dangerous animals on the planet had simply stopped by to make a point and then, satisfied, gone home to lunch. The formal signing happened that same afternoon in the cabin's front room rather than the clearing, because Ithval, practical to the last, pointed out that a legal document required a table and a working pen rather than an audience of predators, however persuasive their earlier appearance had been. Don signed the assembly's final endorsement without a single further objection, his crest held in the low, level posture Myra had learned, across 2 very different species now, to read as genuine respect rather than performance. Yarrow signed as the Protectorate's first civilian observer of record, a title he accepted with the same dry, unhurried grace he brought to everything, though Myra caught him wiping at his eyes once briefly, when Ithval read aloud the finding's final line, a line Myra herself had insisted on, over 3 separate drafts, until the regional office finally agreed to include it word for word. That the 11 names lost to 9 years of concealed violence be entered into the Protectorate's founding record not as casualties of an exclusion zone, but as the reason its truth was finally worth uncovering. "He'd have liked that," Yarrow said quietly, after the others had filed back out to the clearing to let the recording crew capture the ceremony's closing footage, leaving just Myra, Rye dozing at the hearth, and an old man looking at a signature he'd waited 14 years to be asked for. "My partner. He wasn't a good man exactly. He broke the rule that killed him, and I've spent 14 years angry at him for it as much as grieving him. But he didn't deserve to be a line in someone's cover story. None of them did." He set the pen down carefully, the way a man sets down something considerably heavier than its weight. "You gave him his name back. That's not nothing, Myra. I don't think you understand yet how much that isn't nothing." "I think I understand it a little," Myra said, and meant it, thinking of 41 days of talking to nobody but a dog, of a logbook full of careful observations nobody had believed until they had no choice, of every name on Ithval's list that had waited 9 years for someone to finally ask the inconvenient question. "I just didn't have anyone left to owe silence to. That's the only difference between what I did and what you did 14 years ago. You weren't a coward, Desmond. You were just the only one still standing close enough to lose something if you spoke up. I got lucky. I didn't have anything left to lose by the time anyone was listening." Yarrow didn't argue the point, which Myra had learned over a year was as close as he came to agreeing with something he still privately doubted, and instead reached down to scratch behind Rye's ears with the easy, familiar affection of a man who'd long since stopped thinking of the dog as anything other than family. "What happens now?" he asked. "Once the paperwork's done and the delegation's gone home and it's just you, the dog, and half a forest full of things 12 times your size out there deciding whether they still like you tomorrow." Myra looked out through the cabin's real glass window, past the fenced garden, toward the tree line where the pale spring light was beginning to lengthen into evening, and thought about the question longer than it probably needed. "The same thing that's been happening for a year," she said finally. "I keep the fire going, I feed what comes close, I don't chase what runs. And I let them decide, on their own timeline, exactly how much of themselves they want to trust me with." She reached down without looking, the old habit, and found Rye's ear beneath her fingers exactly where it always was. "It worked the first time because I didn't have a plan. I don't intend to ruin it now by pretending I've suddenly got one." The delegation left before full dark, the recording crew's transport lifting off the cleared strip beyond the garden in a long, slow arc that startled a scattering of birds from the canopy but nothing larger. And by the time the last engine whine had faded into the ordinary evening quiet of the forest, the cabin clearing had gone back to precisely the size and shape it had been every evening for the better part of a year. Small, ordinary, a single fire, a dog, and a woman who had stopped. A long time ago now, needing an audience to know exactly what she had. Then stayed the extra hour it took to see the last transport off, standing with Myra at the fence line's edge, watching the sky settle back into stars now that the transport's running lights had cleared the atmosphere. "Bethrin would have liked seeing that," he said after a while. "The Marshal envoy apologizing to a dog. I think that's the version of this whole year he'd have wanted to be remembered for making possible, even if he wasn't the one standing in the clearing for it." "You could write to him," Myra said. "Tell him." "I have," Ven admitted. "Twice. He hasn't answered either letter, which I understand. I don't think he's ready yet to hear that any of this turned out well. I think, for a man who spent 9 years protecting a comfortable story, watching it become an honest one from 3 systems away is its own kind of difficult." He glanced at her sideways, the careful posture he still fell into sometimes when he wasn't certain how a thing would land. "For what it's worth, and I understand it may not be worth much, given everything it cost to get here, I don't regret a single report I filed, even the ones that went nowhere for 4 years. I'd rather have been the person who kept filing them and lost than the person who stopped." "That's worth quite a lot, actually," Myra said. "More than you'd probably let yourself believe." He left not long after, back toward the landing under a sky gone fully dark and thick with stars neither of them had ever bothered to learn the local names for, and Myra stood at the fence a while longer alone, listening to the ordinary night sounds of a forest that had spent a year slowly, patiently, deciding it had no further use for the word forbidden. Sable's call rose once, distant and unhurried, somewhere past the tree line, not an alarm, not a summons, just the same evening announcement he'd been making for a year now, the sound of something settling in for the night exactly where it meant to be. Somewhere further out, past even that, Myra thought she heard something larger shift through the deep brush, slow and patient and entirely unbothered, making its own last patient circuit of ground it had defended, alone, for 9 years before anyone thought to ask it a single honest question. She went back inside before the cold fully settled, banked the fire the way she banked it every night, and found Rye already curled at the hearth's edge, one eye cracking open at the sound of the door, tail giving a single slow thump against the stone before settling back into sleep. "Big day," Myra told her, sitting down on the floor beside her the way she had every night for a year now, more comfortable, if she was honest, on the hearthstone than in any chair the cabin owned. "You handled it better than I did." Rye, for her part, offered no opinion on the matter, because she was a dog, and animals didn't answer, and never had, and Myra had learned over a very long year that they didn't especially need to. The last real trouble came that summer, and it came, as trouble in this forest always had, from people who still hadn't finished believing the story the finding had already settled. Halk brought the warning herself, riding out unannounced on a supply run 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which told Myra before a single word was spoken that whatever she'd come to say wasn't going to wait for the normal rotation. 3 names had surfaced in the widening investigation, she said, associates of Talvin's who'd moved product through the exchange post for years and had, until recently, been quietly cooperating with Ithval's inquiry in exchange for lighter sentencing. 2 weeks ago they'd stopped cooperating, stopped answering summons, and disappeared from their last known postings entirely. And a cargo hauler registered to one of them had been logged, 3 nights running, making short, unscheduled flights along the Protectorate's outer boundary, running dark, no transponder, no manifest. "They're not coming for pelts," Halk said, standing in the cabin's front room with her helmet under one arm, the flat professional comm she'd carried since the inquiry board finally cracking, just slightly at the edges. "Pelts don't need 3 men and a dark cargo run this close to a reclassified zone with active monitoring. I think they're coming for you, Myra. I think they've worked out that everything Talvin lost. He lost the night he touched your dog in front of a witness who wouldn't let it go. And I think the smartest of them has decided the cleanest fix to 9 years of unraveling evidence is a survey witness who stops being available to testify further." "Then they've picked a strange place to try it," Myra said, though she felt the old cold clarity settle over her anyway, the same one that had gotten her through 41 days alone and a poisoned water jug and a man's hand reaching for a dog that had every reason not to let it land. "I'm not exactly isolated anymore." "You're exactly as isolated as you've always been, the moment it's dark and the fire's the only light for 2 kilometers, Halk said. "I'd like to post a rotation out here until this resolves. Bethren's replacement has already authorized it." Myra thought about it for exactly as long as it took to glance at Rye, dozing in her usual spot by the hearth, gray-muzzled and slower now, but no less certain in the way her ear tracked every new voice in the room. And at the window beyond her, dark already with the early summer dusk, past which lay 11 years of a forest that had made its own opinions about people who came at her with bad intentions considerably clearer than any garrison rotation ever could. "Post the rotation if it makes the regional office feel better," she said. "But Halk, I don't think they're going to get anywhere near this cabin. I think whatever's out past that fence line already knows something's wrong, the same way it knew 2 nights before the garrison fence, the same way it knew the day Kessing's team walked somewhere they hadn't been invited. I've stopped needing to explain how it knows. It just does." She was, in the end, more right than she expected to be, and less right than she'd have liked, because it was not entirely bloodless the way the garrison incident and the survey incident had been, and Myra carried the shape of that difference for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she turned over every hard lesson this forest had taught her. The cargo hauler came in low on the 3rd night of Halk's rotation, running dark exactly as the flight logs had warned, and made it further than anyone expected before the perimeter sensors, upgraded twice since the water jug incident, at Ven's insistence, caught the heat bloom of its engines cutting low over the tree line half a kilometer out. 2 men came the rest of the way on foot, night optics and short-barreled weapons, moving with the trained economy of people who'd done this kind of quiet work before. And Myra understood, watching the sensor feed Halk's team relayed to the cabin's small comm unit, exactly how close they might have come if the forest itself hadn't already decided, well before either woman inside the cabin knew a single name. That men moving through its dark with weapons drawn were not the kind of guest it extended courtesy to. Nobody at the cabin ever saw exactly what happened in the half-kilometer of tree line between the hauler's landing site and the fence, and nobody, afterward, pushed very hard to have it fully reconstructed. Halk's rotation found 1 man at first light, sitting against a black bark trunk 200 meters out, weapon discarded some distance from his open, unresisting hands, utterly unhurt and utterly unwilling, for the better part of an hour, to say a single coherent word about what he'd seen in the dark that had made him drop a loaded weapon and simply wait, shaking, for morning and whatever came with it. The second man they never found at all, not a body, not gear beyond a single abandoned pack, nothing but a trail of disturbed leaf litter leading deeper into core territory than any search party Halk authorized was willing to follow, and a report that closed, eventually, with the flat administrative language Myra had learned by now meant nobody wanted to write down what they actually suspected. Subject presumed to have fled the exclusion zone on foot. Search discontinued per Protectorate access restrictions. Myra never asked Yarrow what he thought had actually happened, and Yarrow, for his part, never volunteered it, though she caught him looking toward the deep tree line more than once that summer with an expression she'd come to recognize as a man doing careful, private arithmetic he had no intention of showing his work on. "They came here to make sure I couldn't testify," Myra said to Rye that same evening, low, mostly to herself, sitting on the hearthstone with the dog's graying head heavy in her lap, while outside the cabin Halk's rotation stood a watch that had, by every practical measure, already become unnecessary. "I keep telling everyone the forest doesn't hurt people who aren't hunting something in it. I still believe that. I have to believe that because it's true, and because the alternative is believing I've spent 2 years making a home in the middle of something I don't actually understand at all." She scratched behind the dog's ear, slow, and Rye leaned into it with a soft, contented sound that asked for nothing and forgave everything, the way she always had. "But he came here with a weapon and a plan to make sure I never spoke again. And whatever's out there decided, on its own, without me asking it to, that it wasn't going to let that happen. I don't think that's the same thing as violence for its own sake. I think that's just what happens when you threaten someone this ground has already decided is worth protecting. I don't love it. I don't think I'm supposed to love it. But I understand it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it's an uncomfortable thing to sit with." Rye didn't answer, because she never did, but she stayed exactly where she was until well past midnight, warm and solid and unbothered against Myra's knee. And by the time Myra finally banked the fire and went to bed, the old cold clarity that had carried her through 41 days alone had settled at last into something closer to peace than she'd expected trouble like that to leave behind. Autumn came around a second time before the last of it finally settled, the way Myra had come to understand most things in this forest settled, not with an ending exactly, but with a kind of patient arithmetic that stopped needing to be watched so closely once it had proven itself often enough. The Protectorate's boundary held. Kessing's amended language, tested twice more that year by hopeful contractors who'd read "restricted" as an invitation rather than a wall, proved exactly as persuasive on paper as the matriarch's silent withdrawal had been in person. And by the second spring, the regional office had stopped sending anyone at all without Myra's field clearance attached in writing, which suited her considerably better than the alternative. Talvin's sentence, appealed once and denied, settled into a long, quiet, unremarkable stretch of labor restitution on a prison colony 3 systems distant, and Myra found, when Halk mentioned it in passing on one of the supply runs, that she felt almost nothing about it at all, not satisfaction, not mercy, just the flat closing of a ledger that had already balanced itself the night 6 animals walked up to a garrison fence and chose, of their own accord, not to become the ending Talvin had spent 9 years betting they'd never need to become. Sable, fully grown now and settled into a range that overlapped the cabin's fence line more than any wild canopy stalker's territory had any right to, brought a mate to the clearing in the second autumn. A wary, watchful female Myra never managed to properly name, because the animal never once came close enough to earn one. Content instead to watch from the tree line, while Sable did the trusting for both of them. The way animals had apparently always split that particular labor between mates on every world Myra had ever heard of. There would be young the following spring, Yarrow predicted, studying the pair's behavior with the quiet professional satisfaction of a man watching a field guide write itself in real time. And Myra found she was already looking forward to it with an eagerness that would have astonished the exhausted, starving woman who'd first watched an 8-month juvenile lie down across her fire, and decided, with nothing left to lose, to share her dinner with him. Salt and Pepper had 4 young of their own by the second winter, small and quick, and utterly unbothered by the cabin's presence, which Yarrow's survey notes now described, with visible restraint, as a level of habituation previously unrecorded in this species and worth considerably more study than the regional office has currently funded. Myra mostly just enjoyed watching them chase each other around the woodpile at dusk, which struck her as a perfectly good use of a forest that had spent 9 years being called nothing but a grave. The matriarch kept her distance, exactly as she always had, showing herself perhaps once a month now rather than once every 10 days, which Yarrow read as a good sign rather than a worrying one. The settled patience of a landlord who had finally stopped needing to check in so often because the tenant had proven, beyond any further doubt, that the arrangement was sound. Myra still raised a hand every time she caught that pale silhouette at the tree line's edge, and every time, without fail, the great head lowered a fraction before withdrawing, and Myra had stopped, sometime in the second year, needing to understand exactly what passed between them in that gesture. It was enough that something did. Rye slowed down that second winter, the way old dogs did, sleeping later into the mornings, taking the cabin's front steps with more visible care than she once had, and Myra watched it happen with the particular ache anyone who had ever loved a dog past its middle years understood without needing it explained. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Just the quiet arithmetic of a clock she'd rather not be doing math against. She still rose every time a stranger's footstep crossed the fence line. She still planted herself, unhurried and immovable, between Myra and anything that reached too fast toward either of them. She simply did it now with the gray-muzzled deliberateness of an animal who had earned the right to take her time about it, and Myra found she loved her considerably more for the slowness than she'd ever loved the speed. It was on an ordinary evening near the second winter's first frost, the fire built up a little higher than usual against the coming cold, that the cabin had its last visitor of real consequence, though Myra wouldn't understand that it was a visitor of consequence until well after the pot was already on the coals. She heard the footsteps before Rye did, which almost never happened anymore, and was on her feet at the door before the knock came, the old 6 weeks alone instinct never quite having left her even 2 years and a proper roof later. The boy on the step couldn't have been more than 11, filthy, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a jacket 3 sizes too large that Myra recognized, with a cold lurch, as standard-issue survival gear from a Bramlow landing transport manifest. The same gear she'd been wearing, in a smaller size, the night her own skiff had gone down 2 winters before. There was a crash, he managed, before his legs gave out and Myra caught him under the arms, lighter than he should have been, shaking with cold and hunger and something past both. 2 days back, North Ridge. I walked because I didn't know what else. Everyone said the forest would. Everyone said it was. I know what everyone said, Myra told him, steady, already moving him toward the fire, already reaching for the pot she kept simmering most evenings out of nothing more than the old, unbroken habit of a woman who had once needed exactly this and had nobody there to offer it. They were wrong. You're safe here. What's your name? Perrin, he managed, teeth chattering, eyes going wide and disbelieving over Myra's shoulder at the sight of a large brindled dog rising from the hearth with slow, careful concern rather than alarm, coming to press her graying muzzle against his knee with the exact gentle weight she'd once pressed against Myra's own, the second night after the crash, when Myra had finally stopped being too afraid to let herself be comforted. Is that? That's right, Myra said, ladling stew into a bowl with hands that had done this so many times now they barely needed watching. She's going to sit with you while I get this warm, and she's not going to leave your side until you stop shaking, because that's just what she does. You're going to be fine, Perrin, I promise you. This forest's not what they told you it was. Neither is that dog. Outside, past the fence line, in the deepening dark of the second winter's first hard frost, Myra heard Sable's low call rise once, unhurried, and thought, though she'd never be entirely sure, and never much cared to be, that somewhere further out past even that, something considerably larger had paused in its patient circuit of the ground it had defended for 11 years now, and had simply, briefly, listened. She sat down across the fire from the shaking, hollow-eyed boy who reminded her so precisely of herself 2 winters before that it ached somewhere she'd stopped expecting to feel any more, and handed him the bowl, and watched Rye settle her graying weight warm against his side exactly the way she had against Myra's, once, a lifetime and a whole reclassified forest ago. Eat slow, Myra told him. You've got time now. Nothing out there is going to hurt you. And in a few days, once you've got your strength back, I'll walk you out to the boundary myself, and you can tell the whole landing exactly what you found out here instead of what they warned you about. Perrin ate slowly, exactly as told, and somewhere near the bottom of the bowl, with Rye's warm weight solid against his ribs and the fire burning low and steady in the stone hearth Yarrow had built with his own 2 hands, he finally, for the first time in 2 days, stopped shaking. Myra banked the fire late that night, the way she banked it every night, checked the door, and sat a while on the front step with Rye's head heavy in her lap and the cold, clear stars wheeling overhead exactly as unbothered as they'd been the night a raider's shot had first put her here, 2 years and 1 whole world's worth of assumptions ago. The forest wasn't forbidden. It never really had been. It had simply been waiting, patient as anything with claws and time on its side could afford to be, for someone tired enough and honest enough to stop treating it like a threat to be managed, and start treating it like a place that might, if given half a reason, decide to let her stay. She hadn't brought soldiers. She hadn't brought weapons, or clever devices, or any plan sturdier than a fire starter and a dog too stubborn to leave her side. She'd brought a pot of stew and the plain, unglamorous patience to keep making it every night whether anyone came to share it or not. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of all those ordinary evenings, without ever once meaning to, she'd built the one thing this forest had apparently been missing for 9 long, misunderstood years. Not a conqueror, not a guardian, even not really, whatever the findings' careful language wanted to call her. Just somebody worth coming home to. Rye sighed against her knee, the long, contented sigh of a dog who considered the day thoroughly, finally concluded, and Myra sat with her a while longer under the stars, listening to the ordinary night sounds of a forest that had, at long last, stopped needing to prove to anyone at all how little it had ever wanted to be feared.